Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto Kage of another village Kage Summit. Before I start, please support for more amazing content, and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Santana 2 and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Jinchuriki, as defined by the order of the collective daimyo of the land, a human body acting as a container to that which is inhuman, or containing power that may be considered beyond that of known human ability. I don't understand, Tsunade said, facing the daimyo across the massive table between them. As I said, Lady Hokage, the daimyo's spokesman said patiently, the lords of the land have called you here concerning the recent misfortune that has befallen the Hidden Leaf. Yes, I got that, thanks, Tsunade replied much less patiently. Misfortune was an almost insulting thing to call the complete and utter destruction pain had wrought on Konoha, and the Hokage would much prefer to be there, fixing it, instead of 3 days travel away in this meeting, and I thank you for your concern. I hope to have your support in the coming reconstruction. But she still had to be diplomatic because they really needed all the support they could get. What I don't understand is why all of the feudal lords felt the need to be here, Tsunade continued, eyeing not just the fire daimyo, who sent her the emergency summon, but those from other lands as well, ridiculous headgear and all, or why the Raikage is also present. She nodded respectfully to the dark-skinned man sitting next to her, who acknowledged her in return. I would also like an explanation, the Raikage rumbled, clearly annoyed. I sympathize with the Leaf's predicament, but I try not to make a habit of interfering in the affairs of other villages if I can help it. The spokesman nodded. I see. Then let us be brief. He cleared his throat. This emergency meeting held by the collective daimyo of the land concerns the increasingly apparent Jinchuriki problem. The spokesman stood silent for a moment as if expecting a response. When both Kages, Tsunade for one, wondering how much political bull she was going to have to sift through to get to the point of this meeting, simply stared. He cleared his throat again. As your villages are the only remaining hidden villages with known surviving Jinchuriki residing within them, we have called you here to personally inform you of the daimyo's recent decision concerning these individuals. However, this message will be issued to every village, no matter its status, as it affects them as well. He paused again, looking a bit nervous. You said you would be brief, the Raikage suddenly growled, and if Tsunade wasn't grappling with the sudden curl of foreboding in her belly, she would have had to fight off an amused snort. Yes, the spokesman said, so I shall. The daimyo have issued a new law, demanding the removal of all Jinchuriki, as defined by this council, from all villages, shinobi and civilian alike, effective immediately. Silence, and then an almighty crack as the table split straight down the middle under the iron grip of the Raikage. No, the Kumo leader growled through gritted teeth, which Tsunade was grateful for as her own voice was stuck somewhere in her throat. Naruto. The spokesman had scrambled back when the table cracked, and now stood speechless. The Miss Daimyo sighed and stood, fixing the Raikage with a dark glare. We realize that this is difficult, for you in particular, Raikage-san. But, you are overstepping. Tsunade finally found her voice. None of you can delegate the running and the tradition of a shinobi village. That is the responsibility of the Kage you chose. As for the Jinchuriki, Naruto saved us. They have become a problem. The Miss Daimyo spoke over her. The daimyo reserve the right to take action wherever we see fit, including within the shinobi villages. And the shinobi have had free run of this land for far too long. He shook his head as if the shinobi he spoke of were flies around his head. But I digress. As we understand it, in point of fact, Lady Hokage, the Jinchuriki entrusted to your village was involved in its destruction. What? Tsunade was sure Shizen, who was standing just outside the door, could hear. Naruto is the only reason I'm not digging mass graves right now. But it was because of him, and the thing sealed within him that the Akatsuki attacked the Hidden Leaf in the first place, is it not? One of the other daimyos spoke up. The Raikage answered this time. And I suppose that also makes it my brother's fault for the attempt on his life? Static was rolling off him in barely restrained waves. Any and all shinobi have the potential to be attacked within their respective villages by outside forces. It is the nature of our position. That is not the only issue here, the fire daimyo spoke up finally, surprising Tsunade. This kind of debate was usually too hot for him. We have begun to feel that the Jinchuriki are too great and unpredictable a force to be entrusted to a single village. So, you're just going to kick them out and let them run off into the wilderness? Tsunade almost laughed. That's the best solution you came up with? Oh, Naruto, I won't let them, I swear. They are practically beasts as it is. Miss Daimyo again, now finding his speed, a powder keg hanging over a fire, always ready to blow. The first Hokage must have been insane, passing them out to the hidden villages like playing cards. Tsunade tried very hard not to leap across the damaged table at the man, until the Akatsuki decided to exploit that. We were at peace for the first time in so long. You must know we will not stand for this. The Raikage's knuckles were wide on the two halves of the table, voice low and dangerous. We will not let it happen. The daimyo all went quiet at the Raikage's words. Then the Miss Daimyo, apparently the new spokesman now, spoke quietly although his words seemed to echo throughout the room. That is why it has already happened, Raikage-san. Tsunade felt her throat freeze again but somehow forced out the words. What do you mean? We mean that this emergency summons has a dual purpose, the Miss Daimyo said, almost smug. And Tsunade again had the urge to finish the job the Raikage had started with the table on the Lord's face. To inform you of our decision and to keep you from hindering it. You called us here so you could get rid of the Jinchuriki without us inside the village to stop you, Tsunade almost whispered. By some miracle, the Reikage only killed the table on his way out the door, and Tsunade was right in his heels. You have not been dismissed, she heard the Miss Daimyo shout after them, but the Hokage ignored him. It was for his own safety, really. Shizen! Tsunade was already striding past her stunned assistant, and the two ANBU they had brought along. We have to get back to the village now. The Reikage and his guard had already disappeared, his jutsu granting him the extra speed. Suddenly it made horrible sense why the daimyo had decided to have a meeting that was nearly 3 days' travel from either village. Right now she was pretty sure she could make it back to Konoha in a fraction of that time. Naruto, please don't do anything stupid. When Naruto was called into the Hokage's temporary headquarters, he was naturally expecting to see Tsunade, not a bunch of people in black uniforms who surrounded him as soon as he walked in. It was a bit disconcerting, to say the least. Naruto, quickly tense for a fight, glanced around at the black-clad people, unable to see any of their faces due to the masks that covered every inch of their faces, only leaving slits for their eyes. Naruto figured there were at least a dozen he could see, but had enough experience to know there must be more elsewhere. His eyes landed on the only other uncovered face in the room, a gray-haired man who looked to be in his late 50s, sitting arrogantly at the Hokage's desk. He was dressed in the same all-black uniform as the others and was staring at a scroll in his hands, not looking at Naruto. Naruto began elegantly when his access to the door was cut off. What's going on? Where's Grandma Tsunade? About 1,000 other questions crowded into his head for attention as well, but by the look of his situation he'd have to pick and choose. The gray-haired man still didn't look at him and ignored his questions, asking his own, "You are Uzumaki Naruto, correct?" "Yeah, that's me," Naruto answered, now officially annoyed. "And you are?" "That is none of your business," the man said evenly, finally setting down his scroll and looking up at the blonde, studying him carefully for a moment. Naruto had to fight not to squirm under the man's iron-gray eyes. It reminded him too much of the TI shinobi. But the stranger continued, "I will tell you that if you cooperate with me this will go much easier. For you and your village." The man paused, giving a considering look to the room they were in. "Well, what's left of it, anyway?" The unprovoked glare he leveled at Naruto then would have made Ibiki cringe. Naruto only tensed further at the mention of the village. Were they in danger again? "Well, spit it out then," Naruto said, impatience getting the better of him. "What do you want? Is this about the Akatsuki?" His question spilled out unbidden, and he was only able to stop when the man held up a hand. "Yes and no," the man said cryptically, lowering his arm to rest behind his back. "But as for what we want, it is quite simple." He stood then to his full height, which was more significant than Naruto thought while the man had been sitting, and back straight and chin raised, said clearly and deliberately, "You, Uzumaki Naruto, being the container of the Nine-Tails Demon Fox, are hereby ordered to leave Konohagakure immediately and never to return. This is by order of the Fire Daimyo. We have been dispatched to make sure this order is carried out swiftly. We have been licensed to use force if we have to." The man fell silent after his speech and watched Naruto expectantly. Naruto, for his part, wasn't sure he just heard right. That or this guy was cracked. In fact, his so-called order was so ridiculous that Naruto, so true to form it was painful, laughed. A short bark of a thing that spoke more of disbelief than humor, but laughter all the same. It seemed to startle the gray-haired man more than anything else Naruto could have done. "I fail to see the humor, boy," he hissed. Naruto snorted again. He couldn't help it. "You can't be serious. You can't order me out of my own village. I've done nothing wrong for one. At least nothing lately that would piss Tsunade off enough to throw him out. Of that he was sure. Tsunade isn't here though." Then the mysterious man said something that chilled Naruto right to his core. "You are a Jinchuriki. That's more than enough. The daimyo has ordered your removal, and I will see to it that his order is carried out." All laughter faded from him as Naruto finally let the man's words sink in. They were going to make him leave Konoha. They were exiling him. He has been a Jinchuriki his entire life. In case it escaped your notice, a voice from behind Naruto said clearly, "What has changed now?" Naruto turned toward the new voice and was more confused than ever. Danzo stood just inside the door, also surrounded by some very confused black-clad soldiers. He moved farther inside, past Naruto, still too stunned to question the elder's presence, and right up to the gray-haired leader. One look at the leader of these strangers and Naruto knew he was just as confused as to how Danzo had gotten into the secluded room as he was. "I am an elder of this village," Danzo said levelly. "You will answer my question." Naruto didn't know much about Danzo, no one did really, just that Lady Tsunade didn't like him, and he was into some pretty shady stuff, hang around Sai for 5 minutes. And Naruto also knew that if Danzo was coming to his defense, he was in more trouble than he thought. The leader's eyes narrowed but he did answer, "The Jinchuriki have been declared by your superiors to be too dangerous to inhabit a village with other humans." Naruto felt himself physically flinch at that. "They are too unpredictable. I would think you would understand after everything that has happened." Danzo seemed to take a moment to consider this before he answered, "The Uzumaki boy had nothing to do with. My orders are to remove him." Gray hair cut him off. "I will not argue technicalities with you. This is the order of the daimyo. Nothing you say now will change it." Danzo's grip tightened on his cane. It wasn't often he was disrespected. "The daimyo, you say?" Danzo paused again. Tell me, where's Lady Tsunade? It is most unusual for her not to be present for something of this importance. The Hokage is in an emergency meeting with the fire daimyo concerning the recent destruction, Gray Hair said simply. There was a pause where Naruto could practically hear the gears in Danzo's head turning. I see, Danzo finally said quietly, something in his voice resonating with Naruto. It was as if Danzo had just uncovered something filthy and didn't know how to get rid of it. I see. Naruto felt something click in his head at those words and a horrible, awful possibility occurred to him. Where was Granny Tsunade? Where was anyone? Danzo was the only person here defending him against these strangers and Naruto was under no delusion as to why. Danzo saw him, the Jinchuriki, as a military weapon, always had. He would fight tooth and nail to keep Naruto in the village for that and nothing else. But Granny Tsunade was at a meeting with the daimyo. The daimyo who was apparently ordering him out of his village, his home. Does Tsunade think I'm too dangerous? Naruto shook his head. No, that couldn't be, it just couldn't. Tsunade cared about him, was proud of him. She wouldn't go along with this. Then why isn't she here, HM? Naruto shook his head again and realized Danzo and Gray Hair had begun arguing while he'd been lost in thought. This is outrageous, Danzo was saying, voice very nearly rising. You cannot expect us to just take this lying down. And you should know, Gray Hair said over him again, that I am authorized to use force. I do not think your village is in any condition for another fight. Do you? Danzo went quiet, and Naruto knew the answer. No, they couldn't. Despite Nagato's last act, the village had suffered heavy casualties and had only just started rebuilding. Half the population that had survived were still living in tents, or at best in smaller neighboring villages. Naruto didn't know the extent these guys would go to carry out their orders and he didn't want to test them. Danzo had just opened his mouth to speak again when Naruto finally found his voice. I'll go. Every head turned to the blonde. Gray Hair cocked an eyebrow at him suspiciously. Oh, really? I hadn't thought you could be so reasonable. Naruto spared the stranger a glare before turning his eyes to Danzo, his next point being to convince him, and myself, we can't get into it with the daimyo right now. I know that, we need all the help we can get and Naruto paused trying to find words. I'm just one person, we have to think of the village. I'll leave and entrust Grandma Tsunade to work it out. Danzo stared at Naruto for a very long time, lips pursed and cane gripped too tight in his hand. Danzo, for all his secrecy and dislike for the Hokage, did what he did to protect the village. Always. Naruto knew he must be having an internal battle right now, save the village from another fight or hang on to the Jinchuriki? The blonde saw it in the line of the older man's shoulders when he came to his decision. Naruto meant it, every word, but it still hurt when Danzo sighed and nodded in agreement. Naruto, though, it said something about his situation that he could actually want Danzo of all people to argue on his behalf. Well, there's no one else here, so. Naruto shook his head. Danzo was speaking to Gray Hair again. Very well, we will cooperate. For now. What Naruto could see of Danzo's face was thunderous. Gray Hair nodded as if that was the only conclusion that would come of this. When he turned back to Naruto he made some hand gesture to the other people in the room, looking nearly smug. We will escort you to the gate. Now? Naruto finally started feeling an edge of panic as the black-clad strangers moved closer to him. Can't I? Immediately, Gray Hair said severely and came out from behind the desk to stand directly in front of Naruto. We will not be delayed any longer, now come. Naruto had to use every ounce of restraint he possessed not to attack when two Sauders walked up, grabbed his arms, and started dragging him to the door. Apparently he wasn't even allowed to pack. Where is everyone? Once they were to the door Naruto saw the answer to his question. The streets immediately outside the building were deserted. Taking precautions for the big bad Jinchuriki, no doubt. One of the men gave a jerky tug to his arm and Naruto snatched it out of his grasp. I get the picture, the blonde hissed. I don't need your escort, but thanks so much for your consideration. With that Naruto leapt up to the nearest roof, one that probably hadn't even been there yesterday, and began to run full tilt toward the gates. The daimyo's soldiers chased after him, but they couldn't keep up with an angry Naruto. That and when they realized he was indeed running toward the gates, they seemed content to just keep eyes on him. Naruto felt an unprecedented amount of satisfaction when he dispatched a shadow clone right under their noses. The clone managed to slip away to Naruto's apartment for his mission bag, always pre-packed with the essentials for those last-minute missions. The least these jerks could have done was let him pack. Knowing his clone would meet him at a designated spot in the forest later, Naruto picked up the pace, trying to at least make these jerks work before he lost them. For all he knew they tried to kill him as soon as he got far enough away from the village. With that lovely parting thought Naruto shut off his brain and ran for the gates on memory and instinct. He was tired of thinking. Where is everyone? Later, Shikamaru thought he should get the Yamanaka clan to examine his head, because he had to have had a brief stroke not to notice something was wrong sooner. To be fair though, Shikamaru had asked his father why the daimyos were suddenly in the village. He recognized them from the few diplomatic trips he'd been to as part of the Hokage's company. Shikaka had stared at the black-clad group walking orderly into the village and shrugged. If the Hokage had wanted us to know what was going on, she'd have told us before she left, the elder Nara had said. And Shikamaru had accepted it. In hindsight Shikamaru thought he deserved a kunai to the head for that slip. The Nara was with Ano, Sakura, and Choji in the makeshift marketplace that had been set up in the middle of the makeshift town when he saw, out of his peripheral, something fast and orange fly overhead. Looking up he saw that it was indeed Naruto, being chased it seemed, by at least a dozen people in all black, featureless clothing. Now, Naruto got chased quite often, he tended to piss people off like that. That's not what was scary. What unsettled Shikamaru was the look he saw on his friend's face, and the fact that Naruto was running like the devil himself was behind him. Hey, Sakura apparently noticed too as she stepped up next to Shikamaru and stared after Naruto. What's going on? Who are those people? They're the daimyo's personal soldiers, Shikamaru said just loud enough for his companions to hear. We need to help him. Ino and Choji finally turned at the urgency in the Nara's normally bored voice. The other three nodded, but before any of them could make a move to go after them, they were stopped by yet another of the black-clad men. Please do not interfere, the man said holding up a hand. We do not want to hurt anyone, but we will if we have to. That was when Shikamaru actually saw. The men were everywhere, the streets were crawling with them. How could no one have noticed? That's our friend, Sakura all but growled. Why are you chasing Naruto? The man's eyes, the only part of him they could see, narrowed at them. We are sent by the daimyo. Please do not interfere. Interfere with what? Ino stepped up next to Sakura, a hand on the pink-haired girl's shoulder. With the removal of the Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto, another soldier, perhaps higher ranking, but one couldn't tell by any defining mark. No harm will come to him, or you if you cooperate. We are authorized to restrain or incapacitate if need be. How dare, Sakura, Shikamaru cut her off, fear turning his gut, we can't. He looked the Kunoichi in the eye, trying to convey his seriousness through that look. The Hokage is not in the village, and we can't afford a fight right now. The last was said in a whisper as the Nara gave a significant glance around the marketplace, at the agitated workers and civilians alike. They had just barely started to bounce back from Pain's attack. They couldn't instigate anything with the daimyo's men. Seeming to understand, Sakura cast one last worried glance at where Naruto had disappeared, before nodding. Seeming satisfied that they would comply, the daimyo soldiers stepped back into the shadows of the street, still vigilantly watching. What's happening, Shikamaru? Choji asked in a whisper behind him, Sakura and Ino both turning to him as well. I don't know, Shikamaru admitted, the fact grating his nerves, but we need to find a jounin. They'll know what to do. Shikamaru didn't know that for a fact, but he was hopeful. Hurry. And the force sped off in search of one of the village jounin. What have you gotten yourself into this time, Naruto? Troublesome. Hinata tried to get Kiba to calm down, but neither she, Shino, or the black-clad daimyo soldiers were having any luck. Kiba, please, we don't know, Hinata started, but was shut down once again by her loudest friend. No way. Kiba was yelling at the strange soldiers surrounding them. You think you can just waltz into our village and do what you want? You haven't given me a single good reason why I should cooperate, or why you're after Naruto. Akamaru was doing his level best to back Kiba up by growling all the right places. I want answers. What's going on? They just witnessed Naruto being chased over the rooftops by a large group of strangers. When Team 10 tried to step in, they were stopped by more of the soldiers, at which point Kiba had become belligerent. The situation just got worse from there, and all Hinata could do was wonder at what was happening. Then Kiba did the dumbest thing he could have in the given situation. He took a threatening step toward the daimyo's men and they struck. Kiba, stop, but Shino's almost shout was too late. Kiba dodged the first few soldiers who came at him, but there were too many and one got in a shot to the back of his head. As Kiba went limp, one of the men got Akamaru with a tranquilizer, and the Nikin went down as well. Oh no, Hinata whispered. She moved to help her teammates, but was stopped by Shino's arm in front of her. That was not necessary, Shino said calmly to the strangers. We apologize, one black-clad man said as he lifted Kiba over his shoulder. He didn't sound sorry at all, but he was a threat to our mission. What are you going to do with him? Hinata asked as steadily as she could. Another answered as Akamaru was hoisted up as well. We will lock him up until our mission is carried out, and we have gone. With that they left, leaving Hinata and Shino in the street. Iruka waved to the Kotetsu and Izumo guarding the newly rebuilt gates as he pulled out the message scroll he was delivering. They smiled and waved back. When he got to them though, they weren't looking at him, but over his shoulder. What? The Kotetsu trailed off, getting to his feet. Iruka turned, suddenly hearing the commotion they must have been seeing. Naruto was running for the gate at a speed Iruka was pretty sure only the highest level jounin saved for special missions. More alarming was the dozen or so men keeping pace with him. Naruto and what Iruka finally recognized as person soldiers of the daimyo had swept past them in seconds, no one but Naruto sparing the leaf shinobi any acknowledgement. Naruto looked back just in time to catch Iruka's eye. Iruka had already taken 3 steps after him and was opening his mouth to call out, but a hand wrapping around his wrist and stopped him. The academy teacher had the briefest sight of Naruto closing his eyes and turning away from him before he turned to the person holding his arm. Hataki-san? Iruka stared in disbelief at the copynin still holding him back. What are you doing? He's in trouble. Iruka jerked his arm away and the other man let him go without a fight. Kakashi wasn't looking at him but watching the backs of the fleeing group as they disappeared into the trees. As usual, only a quarter of his face was showing, but even that looked highly troubled. We can't, Kakashi finally said as Kotetsu and Izumo also began protesting. We have to wait for the Hokage. Those are the daimyo's men. Just when Iruka was about to have one of his infamous temper flares and tell the jounin exactly how much he cared whose men they were, Shikamaru, Sakura, Ino, and Choji ran up, having been following Kakashi. You can't just let them leave. Sakura puffed when she stopped beside them. What's the daimyo got to do with this? Iruka demanded. Is Naruto in danger? Kakashi looked as unsure as Iruka had ever seen him as he said, Naruto can handle himself. We need the whole story, but we have to wait. Iruka stared at him a moment longer, then looked out to where Naruto could no longer be seen. His anger cooled as he realized that no one else really understood what had just happened either. Wait for what exactly? Iruka barely whispered. Tsunade came back to a Konoha that was practically radiating dread. She managed to make it back to the village in half the time it took her to get to the meeting with the feudal lords, Shizen and the two Anbu having trouble keeping up. Nevertheless, she had realized early on that it probably wouldn't make any difference. The daimyo's men could have arrived the second she'd left, finished carrying out their orders, and been long gone by the time she was yelling at idiot lords. Which is why, when she walked into her village and saw the black uniformed men still crawling all over the place, she felt a perverse sense of satisfaction at being able to throw them out herself. Naruto Shikamaru had met her at the gates, and the unspoken questions on his face were reflected in the rest of Konoha's residence, as she strode purposefully toward her temporary headquarters. Wherever she looked, civilians and shinobi alike were switching from fearfully regarding the black-clad men openly hiding in the streets to tentative relief when they saw their Hokage. Before Shikamaru could brief her though, Shizen, huffing and puffing behind them, found the breath to ask, Naruto? Is he? She trailed off as the young Nara shook his head gravely. They escorted him out of the city a day and a half ago, Shikamaru said quickly. So, they wanted to make sure she was actually in the meeting and distracted before they went through with it then. Tsunade's heart sank even though she knew this probably would be the outcome. Shikamaru continued, no one saw it coming. And we haven't been able, or willing to make a move with these soldiers here. They've threatened force to anyone who questions what happened, and they've gone so far as to lock up Kiba. The one that seems to be the leader has been holed up in your office since he got back from escorting Naruto out of the village. We've been trying to keep everyone calm about the village hero essentially being exiled, but then these went up overnight. The Nara handed her a flyer with the Fire Daimyo's seal at the top. It was an outline of the official order for all Jinchuriki to be removed from any established village. Something about it bothered Tsunade on first reading, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Go get Kiba out of lockup on order of the Hokage, Tsunade said quickly, shoving the flyer into her inside pocket. We'll need him if he's up for it. If they need convincing, come get me. I'll be in my office. Apparently there was someone in her chair. Kakashi had seen the Godame angry. Hell, the woman lived in a constant state of barely veiled annoyance, with anger simmering just underneath and ready to punch you through a wall at a moment's notice. And considering some of the crap he'd pulled in the past, Hatake had been on the receiving end of that anger enough times to thank whatever deity that might exist for being trained under one of the fastest ninja to ever live. So yes, he could recognize an angry Tsunade at 10 paces and was quite practiced in avoiding her in this state, or bribing her with alcohol, it depended, but he had rarely seen her bat out of hell livid, and the daimyo's men were not as practiced as he was in dodging. Kakashi had, of course, been expecting a certain amount of violence on the part of the Hokage when she got back and threw the daimyo's men out of the village. He did, however, twitch an eyebrow when he saw her literally pick the gray-haired leader up out of her chair and throw him out the door. Shizen, the only person in the village more skilled than Kakashi in dodging angry Tsunades, barely missed being flattened under the man. Kakashi's position on a neighboring rooftop gave him a perfect view of all this, and he had to remind himself repeatedly that elite jounin do not giggle at the sight of another man's pain. Well, unless said jounin is inflicting said pain, and said giggle would add a bit of dramatic flair. The point is, Kakashi did not giggle as the black uniformed leader scrambled to his feet as his men flocked out of the building he'd just been thrown out of to get out of the way of a raging Hokage. Brat! Get down here! Oh, Tsunade was yelling at him. Now it definitely wasn't funny. Now, unlike the daimyo's men, Kakashi didn't scramble, but it was a near thing. Yo, Kakashi said cheerfully as he landed in front of the Hokage. You called, my lady? Tsunade gave him one of the dirtiest looks in her repertoire, but turned back to the gray-haired leader and gave him a dirtier one, saying, You will tell this man exactly where you took Naruto and answer any questions he asks you. Understand? She didn't wait for an answer but turned and strode back toward her temporary headquarters. The man sputtered, I do not answer to. Tsunade turned back, lifted a chakra-infused fist, and hit the ground with enough force and accuracy to make the leader leap back away from the crack she formed, but catching several of the other soldiers in the hole. She stood again, brushed some hair out her face, and locked her eyes with that of the leader's. Do I make myself clear? The leader gave a low growl, but Kakashi thought it was a credit to the man's intelligence when simply nodded affirmative and replied, Our mission is complete, and the Jinchuriki has been removed. However, okay, never mind, this guy was stupid, it won't do any good. I understand that you shinobi seem to think the daimyo's soldiers are just for show. At this the man pulled himself to his full considerable height. But we do have our skills, after all. Be that as it may, Tsunade said quietly, eyes narrowing dangerously. I want you to take this man. She jabbed a thumb so violently at Kakashi he almost flinched, and show him the last place Uzumaki Naruto was seen. And one other thing, carefully, Calculatingly, Tsunade crossed over the gap she'd made in the earth and got right into the taller man's face. The daimyo and I are not really on speaking terms right now, so give him a little message for me. Let him know that another guy recently tried to take Naruto away from this village. A guy that makes the daimyo look like toddlers fighting over a toy. A guy who at least had the decency to show up here himself. She gestured to the continued construction surrounding them, not yet covering the fact that the whole village had just been a crater not long ago. I didn't hand Naruto over then, and I am not about to start now. Tsunade turned again and strode purposefully toward her headquarters. Now run along, little ones. I don't have any more time left to play. She made a shooing motion with her hand that seemed ruffled the gray-haired leader all the more. Finally she paused next to Kakashi, who thought he'd been pretty much forgotten, and said under her breath, if any of them give you any trouble, jutsu them into the next village. Make it ugly, I'm serious. I'll send some others to meet you soon. The door slammed behind her and a slightly traumatized Shizen. For a brief moment there was silence, where the gray-haired leader alternated between glaring at Tsunade's door and at Kakashi, who really felt like the victim here. Seriously, he was an innocent bystander who got dragged into this argument. Granted, he was sitting on that roof so he could keep an eye on the daimyo's men and be there when Tsunade got back, but that was beside the point. Kakashi smiled at the gray-haired man. She's really got a flair for the dramatic, HM? The man just scoffed at him and moved toward the village gates. You know, Kakashi said casually as he caught up with the leader, ignoring and stepping around the men still stuck in the ground. Naruto is my student. The man tensed but kept walking. Oh, well, Kakashi said just as casually, until you went and ran him off. By the way, Hatake Kakashi, copy ninja. He held out a friendly hand for the man to shake, but the other just stared, realization dawning. Oh good, you've heard of me. When the door of her temporary office slammed behind her, Tsunade finally felt like she could breathe. Lady Tsunade? Shizen said carefully from behind her. I'm fine, Tsunade replied quickly. It's just that we managed to fight off Pain, a man powerful enough to turn the leaf into a crater and bring people back from the dead. But I just got outsmarted by a bunch of politicians. Now Naruto is gone, who knows where, with nobody to help, right after he got finished saving the village. She heard her assistant sigh. Yes, I know. Shizen paused. Do you think he's? Naruto can handle himself. Tsunade strode to her desk. I'm surprised he left in the first place, actually. Normally, he's too stubborn to do even what I tell him to. I'm afraid he was convinced if he didn't. A deeper voice spoke up from the doorway. There would be dire consequences for the village. Tsunade closed her eyes and took a very deep breath as Shizen confirmed who the voice belonged to. Danzo-sama. Oh, and sigh. How did you know? I was here, Danzo said. I am curious to know why you weren't, Lady Hokage. Maybe it was her imagination, but for a second it sounded like he was accusing her of something. Sai, dutifully standing off to the side, was looking between the two with something very near anxiousness on his usually blank face. The daimyo decided to be sneaky, Tsunade said, her anger flaring once more. That aside, how'd you find out about it? I was under the impression even my finest jounin were fooled, if only long enough to get Naruto out of the village. That might have been the part that chafed even more than being tricked herself, come to think of it. Not quite all your finest, Lady Hokage, Danzo replied. My agent Sai was with Naruto when he was called in to speak with the leader of these men, and noticed something's amiss. He then alerted me. Danzo paused and took a deep breath. Nevertheless, I believe my presence was inconsequential. Well, at least you were here, Tsunade griped, as little comfort as that brings me. She paused to pull the flyer Shikamaru had handed her, and ignored Danzo's half-glare. Something about the flyer still bugged her, but she just couldn't put her finger in it. Lady Tsunade? Shizen said again. Tsunade looked up at the other three in the room and held the announcement out to Shizen. It's the definition. Shizen blinked and looked down at the flyer, reading it over herself. A definition for Jinchuriki? She paused and passed it to Danzo when he held out his hand. I suppose it's pretty different from what we usually consider to be a Jinchuriki. Tsunade nodded and tapped her desk with a red nail. A Jinchuriki is a human with a tailed beast sealed inside them, nothing else. That definition is much broader. Tsunade began tapping her nail to emphasize each word, beyond that of known human ability. That could be anyone, not just Jinchuriki. Someone with an unlisted or rare Kekii Genkai, for instance. Danzo's only visible eye narrowed. This could spell anarchy. Those have been distributed to every village, Sai spoke up suddenly, not just the 5 great nations, but all of them. Those idiots, and Tsunade was surprised at how bland she sounded. The morning had begun as a nice, sunny day in Konoha, only a few fluffy white clouds drifting through the sky. Now, however, the clouds had turned a heavy gray and covered the sun, suggesting a rainstorm was in store. Which meant any tracking would have to be done in a hurry. Kakashi scanned the sky and the area briefly before reaching in his weapons pouch for a kunai and twirling it around his finger a couple times. So, this was the last place you saw him? He asked Jack, as he had so dubbed the gray-haired leader of the daimyo's troops, since he wouldn't tell them his real name. He should really introduce Jack to Ibiki, they would really get along. Yes, and then he headed east, away from Konoha, Jack said, eyeing the kunai in Kakashi's hand suspiciously. He'd already ordered the last of the daimyo's men away, something Kakashi was somewhat grateful for, because that was fewer people to hang over his shoulder. Jack had brought Kakashi a few hours outside of the village, far enough that the gates had long since disappeared and the main road with it. This was the edge of true wilderness, beyond where academy teachers felt safe taking pre-genin and border patrols stopped. This was typically about where one could consider themselves to be in enemy territory even though Konoha was technically nearby. And no one followed him? Kakashi nicked his finger with his weapon, made a few hand seals, and pressed his palm to the ground. No, Jack was cut off by a puff of smoke and a small pug saying, "Sup, boss?" Packin', Kakashi tilted his head to the Nikin. Kakashi's own nose was good, but something felt off to him. For one, he was hardly picking up any scent at all, not just of Naruto, but of anything in this clearing. It was bizarre to say the least, and he'd feel better with Packin by his side to at least give a second opinion. That won't do any good, Jack said from behind them. Was it Kakashi's imagination or did the ass sound smug? Pardon? The copy meme turned toward the yes, indeed very smug Jack. Packin here is one of the best trackers outside of the Inuzuka clan. Yeah, the pug grouched while scratching an ear with his hind leg. Show a little respect. Jack looked a bit put off at being reprimanded by a tiny dog, and in a language he could understand, but was spared answering for the time being. And speaking of Inuzuka, Kakashi mumbled partly to himself, as a loud HHEYYYY ripped through the air. Kiba was running their way, Akamaru at his side, and a bandage around his head. He'd been locked up since Naruto had left, and had been a right pain the whole time from what Kakashi had heard. One story was that he and Akamaru had taken shifts howling for 24 hours straight. Good for them, in Kakashi's opinion. Just behind him was the rest of Team 8, minus Kurenai. Hinata beckoned Kiba to slow down as Shino managed to still look unhurried. Tsunade had sent reinforcements then. Kiba trotted up to them, ignoring Jack. Thanks for waiting, Lady Tsunade told us to help you track down Naruto since he got a day and a half head start. Packin had already started sniffing, knowing Naruto's scent almost as well as Kakashi's. At a signal from Kiba, Akamaru joined the pug and they began to circle the clearing. Allowing the Nikin to take their time, Kakashi turned to Team 8. Well, here's hoping he didn't go too far. But it's Naruto, so we may have to track the idiot to Wave Country and back. Boss? And I'm not even sure if we can take him back to the village without a diplomatic incident. The Hokage wasn't very thorough with the details. Hey, Kakashi? You don't think he's hurt, do you? Hinata worried. You'd have to ask Jackie Boy that. Kakashi stuck his thumb in direction of the daimyo's man just as he heard a loud bark from Akamaru, and felt a small jaw full of pointy teeth lock onto his ankle. Hey! Kakashi looked down just as Packin dodged his master's foot flying at him. Packin, I've told you not to do that while there are other people around, mutt. Well, pay attention when a dog's trying to tell you something. Packin grouched as Akamaru slumped back to Kiba's side with his ears down, looking as ashamed as any four-legged creature could. Kiba rubbed his Ninken's head in confusion. What's wrong, buddy? We should be on the trail by now. Kiba looked over at his two teammates in slight distress when Akamaru only whined pitifully. Hinata and Shino looked at each other and seemed to come to a silent agreement. Shino raised his arms and insects released into the clearing as Hinata activated her Byakugan, and both began circling the clearing much like the dogs before. That's the thing, Packin continued. We can't find a scent, boss. He was looking deeply troubled at his next statement. It's really weird. Like this whole clearing hasn't been touched by anyone or anything until we got here. The pug shook his head. I don't understand it, boss. But we can't find anything. Not from here anyway. Kakashi was about to ask Packin to kindly expound on that when Jackie Boy finally spoke up again. Like I was trying to explain earlier, your trackers are useless at this interval. Kakashi felt yet another flare of annoyance at the man, but turned and politely raised an eyebrow at him all the same. And what, exactly, does that mean, Jackie? A small tick of irritation was all Kakashi got before Jack reached into his uniform pocket and pulled something out. As I mentioned to the Hokage, the daimyo's men have their own weapons, though perhaps not as flashy as you shinobi would prefer. He handed the small vial to the copying. There was no label, just a grayish-blue liquid that foamed whenever it sloshed inside the container. Kakashi recognized it nonetheless. A scent neutralizer, the Jounin told Kiba as he handed the vial for the younger ninja to inspect, usually only used by ninja on delicate recon missions as an extra precaution, typically good for a few hours at best. He turned back to Jack as Kiba pulled the cork out of it and sniffed. That has to be pretty powerful if you used it when Naruto left. And they'd have to have a lot of it to cover this clearing. This was starting to look a lot worse and more thought out than Kakashi had originally suspected. Apparently this wasn't going to be the simple find your idiot student and drag his dumbass back to the village that he thought either. Jack shrugged carelessly. It's experimental. This was its first field test. The feudal lords thought the leaf and the cloud would be reluctant to let the Jinchuriki go, so they tried to plan for all circumstances. The smug aura was back and Kakashi wondered if Tsunade would mind if he took that as trouble enough to jutsu this guy into the next village. Probably not, but here. Hinata called suddenly, and it may have been the loudest Kakashi had ever heard her. She and Shino were staring at a tree just inside the tree line. Kiba slapped the vial he'd been holding into Jack's chest by way of handing it back and raced over to his teammates. Kakashi made his way over more slowly, wondering what the two could have found with any and all scent trails contaminated as they were. When he got close enough, Shino looked up and pointed to a dark smudge on the bark. It's blood. They can cover the scents but they can't wash away everything. His insects had gathered at the edges of the smudge, inspecting things in their own way. The smudge was small, probably the result of the owner getting snagged on a sharp branch as they hurried by, but nothing serious. It was on the eastern side of the clearing though, and if Jack was telling the truth and no one followed him, it was Naruto's. We'll have to head in the direction Naruto went and hope we pick up a real trail when the scent neutralizer wears runs out, Kakashi said so only Team 8 could hear. If he's heading east, that's the direction we'll take. Spread out to cover more area. Just then the sky gave an ominous rumble and Kakashi was starkly reminded of the limited amount of time they had to pick up the trail. And let's be quick about it. Meanwhile, Tsunade had never been happier to see Gaara's emotionless face in her life. As soon as she'd gotten rid of Danzo, she asked Shizen to set up a video conference with the Kazekage and the Reikage. It had taken quite a bit of finagling to find enough power, but Shizen was capable and made it work. At first she had only hoped to reach the Reikage and see if he was any more successful in stopping the daimyo's men, but then remembered the other Jinchuriki, former or otherwise, she should be concerned about. Unfortunately, Lady Hokage, I was also unable to make it back to my village before B was taken away, the Reikage was saying as Gaara listened to both the other Kage's accounts of what had happened. However, I believe B was less than resistant. He probably sees this as a vacation, outside the village. I wouldn't normally tell you this, but as it seems we are in the same predicament, he trailed off, as Tsunade nodded. The man looked as tired as she felt. It was the kind of tired that only came right after an unforgivable outrage had occurred and there was nothing more one could do than clean up the aftermath. I understand, Reikage, and thank you. Hopefully this will all be resolved without any further conflict, Tsunade said and smiled a little when the Reikage grumbled something about starting a war with the daimyo just on principle. I've also called on you, Gaara-san, to ask if you had received any word about this. You were not at the emergency meeting, but you are a former Jinchuriki. Gaara nodded and reached for something outside the frame of the camera. Yesterday morning, in fact, he held up an almost replica of the flyers that were plastered all over Konoha, but with the Sand Daimyo's seal. These were being put up at the same time one of the feudal lord's messengers gave me this. He held up another scroll with the same seal. I'll save you the pleasure of hearing the entire tedious thing and tell you the gist. They no longer consider me to be a Jinchuriki since the Shikaku was extracted by the Akatsuki. I suspect it also has something to do with my being the Kage of the Sand, therefore too difficult to remove me. He paused and shook his head. They are the ones who agreed to put me in power, therefore it would reflect badly on them if they were to take me out again. Figures, Tsunade sighed. Well, I'm happy to hear that at least. I'm afraid this order will be causing enough chaos without removing a Kage as well. Yes, the Reikage broke in, those posters came to us as well. To every small village or settlement in the country. I've already gotten several reports of unrest in the smaller villages. As have I, Gaara said. These feudal lords have condemned more than just Jinchuriki. Many do not know the difference between a demon carrier and a special ability. We don't know how the more ignorant of society will discriminate, Tsunade agreed, looking out the window as the rainstorm that had been threatening finally hit, sending down buckets without warning. This is going to be a disaster. When they had finally reached a point several hours outside of Konoha, the daimyo's men stopped chasing him. Naruto hesitantly took this as a sign and paused as well, albeit a few yards away from the black-clad soldiers. He waited and so did they, but for what he wasn't sure until the gray-haired leader sauntered into view once again, barely looking winded. Without preamble the man said, You understand, Jinchuriki, that you are exiled and are not to return to this village, yes? Although, to Naruto it didn't sound like a question. Well, since you're the only one here to explain what's going on, I suppose I'll have to take your word for it. The cynical little voice that kept popping into Naruto's thoughts was beginning to sound disturbingly like a certain nine-tailed demon that the blonde had no interest in conversing with at this point in time. Thank you very much. I understand, yes, Naruto replied haltingly, his voice rougher than he thought it should be. If you make any attempt to return or make contact with anyone in the village, we will be forced to follow through on my earlier threat, the man said gravely, pinning Naruto's blue gaze with his own. It will not end well for you or this village, am I clear? Naruto felt his mouth twist and his throat tighten but answered simply, Crystal. Good, the man said and made some signal behind his back at his men. A few of the others came forward carrying pumps full of some foaming liquid that they started to spray on the grass and in the trees, then go. At the word go several kunai and shuriken flew at Naruto and blocked a few but ultimately fled. He didn't notice when his jacket tore on a sharp branch, or that the small cut was bleeding. He was too focused on getting away and where he could possibly go. These people wanted him out of Konoha. Did that mean they wanted him to stay out of every other village as well? He shook his head and added to his speed. Naruto would just have to wait, and hope the others would find him when this mess was sorted out. Yes, he would find a place to hide and wait. The others would find him when it was safe. Or will they? They had not found him. The search had died a wet, muddy death when the rainstorm hit and Kakashi and Team 8 had only had an hour to work out the general direction Naruto had run. On the plus side, the rain had washed away the scent neutralizer the daimyo's men had used. On the downside, it had washed away everything else. In a slightly desperate move on Kakashi's part, he'd summoned his entire pack. Even though they had managed to pick up some vague scent trail, there was no way to follow it to its end in the downpour. Shino's insects were even less effective as they refused to come out of their shelter to face the rain. Kakashi finally had to call it, and they had headed back to the leaf, soaked, miserable, and empty-handed. At the very least the daimyo's men were completely driven out so the bedraggled trackers didn't have to dodge them, or beat them to a bloody pulp. If Kiba's mood was any indication, Tsunade was angry of course, but not at them. Naruto couldn't have gotten that far, the Hokage said, and to Kakashi it sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than them. We'll start the search again when the storm lets up. He's probably just hiding out in a nearby town until things cool off. Which was logical thinking. Except this was Naruto, and with Naruto logical thinking had a tendency to just slide off the table in defeat. The worst part of getting back, though, was when two more people burst through the door of Tsunade's office, and the first was Sakura. She ran in dripping all over the floor, a question already spilling out of her mouth. Where is he? Did you find? But she stopped when she looked at them, with no Naruto to be seen. We're sorry, Sakura, Hinata whispered. Yeah, Kiba said as Akamaru whined. Shino seemed to shrink further into his coat. The way Sakura's face fell nearly killed Kakashi. Because he knew how she felt, like it was happening all over again. The other person who had run in after her, as it happened, was Yumino Irika, which somehow made Kakashi feel worse. He didn't know for sure why he felt that way, but maybe it was because the teacher and Naruto were so close or the way Irika's whole stance hardened when he heard Naruto was still MIA. The unsure, wary glance he directed at Kakashi was nothing new, though. Irika seemed to hold the Kopinin in a special kind of distance ever since those fateful Chunin exams years ago, and the fact that Kakashi had personally held the academy teacher back from chasing after Naruto had apparently not endeared him to the teacher in any way. Boy, he'd gotten an earful for that one. Irika didn't seem to hate him, but honestly Kakashi might have preferred outright disdain as opposed to the tiptoeing that just put him on edge. Nevertheless, Hatake was grateful for the Chunin's presence just then, when he walked up behind Sakura, who looked to be holding back tears, put a hand on her shoulder and said kindly, "It's just bad luck with the storm, Sakura. They'll find him or he'll come back. It's not the same." He gave her shoulder a little squeeze as if to emphasize his point. Naruto loves the leaf. It's not the same. How the Chunin seemed to read Kakashi's mind baffled the Kopinin, but he didn't mind this time. Sakura took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded, seeming to rein herself in. She put her hand over Irika's and said determinedly, "It's okay, guys. It's not your fault." She took another steadying breath and continued, "When the rain stops, we'll try again. And I'll be coming with you to make sure you do it right next time." That got a small laugh out of them, then. The rain didn't stop for 3 more days. But Sakura had joined them, and to Kakashi's surprise, Yumino Irika as well. They only came up empty again. That was 6 months ago. And Naruto was still gone. Even Kakashi had to admit he was getting a little worried. Where the hell could he have gotten to? Tsunade mumbled one day while Kakashi was meeting with her over that very issue. She had more permanent headquarters now, with the village coming along as well as could be expected. Kakashi sat across from her, the desk between them, having the same conversation they'd had 100 times in the past 6 months. "Have you found anything yet, brat?" "No, Lady Hokage, trail's still cold." "Well, keep looking." With varying wording, but the same basic formula. It was discouraging to say the least. "I don't know," Kakashi answered. "When he was on my team I could hear him coming for miles." Kid didn't know the meaning of stealth. Now it's like he's a ghost. He immediately regretted his word choice as that called up a few images Kakashi could have lived without. Maybe traveling with Jiraiya gave him a few pointers. Tsunade said, "That idiot was better at hiding from responsibility than I am." It sounded like a joke, and it might have been, if said idiot was still alive. But he was gone and so was his student. It would be different if there was a scent trail left to follow, Kakashi repeated for the 101st time. But all we have to rely on now is eyewitness accounts. And the last place he might have been seen is in a small village to the east. But even that's shaky at best. Tsunade nodded, rubbing her head and looking like she'd really like to reach for the safe they both knew she had stashed in her desk. He's probably been using a henge all this time, with the daimyo's men crawling all over the place. She could keep them out of Konoha, but she did not have jurisdiction in the smaller villages around them. The daimyo had free reign there, but due to the increasing protests from the villagers they had been steadily backing off more and more each month. There were still many refugees though. What Tsunade and the other Kages had predicted had indeed come to pass. When people in power say there is something to be afraid of, common or ignorant people tend to listen and assume they are right. Therefore, when the daimyo declared that a Jinchuriki could be your next-door neighbor, well, accusations began flying. Shinobi outside of Konoha with any kind of blood limit were being called into question, exiled, and worse. It was a witch hunt at its finest. Some of those refugees had even found their way to Konoha, as the daimyo couldn't reach them there. Any word from the feudal lords recently? Kakashi asked out of curiosity. Tsunade snorted, "They'll let up before the year is out," and she sounded sure about that, and Kakashi figured she had a right to be. They're idiots, but they're not suicidal. They know they can't keep this new law in play for much longer or the unrest will overflow onto their pocketbooks. The daimyo had even tried to exile a few of her other leaf shinobi, Kakashi included, for possessing the implanted Sharingan, but Tsunade had nipped that violently in the bud by informing them that if they interfered with the leaf any further, they would have a war on their hands. And she had the rakeage to back her on that. Chomping at the bit, in fact. Killer Bee was also still missing, although the Raikage had it on pretty good authority that his brother was more interested in staying missing than Naruto was. The only reason the Raikage hadn't declared war was probably because his greatest asset was missing and because, aside from the initial incident, he had been able to keep the daimyo out of his affairs and out of his village. The leaf is recovering as well as can be expected, Tsunade said quietly, looking out the window at the slowing construction. Much of the larger, more official buildings had been rebuilt, and now all that was left were the farther-reaching areas. We'll be able to expand the search without stretching our forces as much. Keep looking. Kakashi decidedly ignored the way the words lacked the conviction they had only a few weeks ago. We'll find him, Lady Hokage. I'll find him. Shizen walked in with a stack of scrolls and Kakashi took that as his cue to go. Before he made it out the door, Tsunade said quietly, "Thank you, brat." Sakura was waiting for him outside, leaning against the wall. "Sakura," Kakashi called as he walked up to his only student still in the village, "do me a favor, would you?" Sakura blinked at his tone and said, "Of course, sensei." "What is it?" He walked up to her and looked her right in the eye, holding her gaze for almost a minute before saying, "Never run off out of the village half-cocked like your idiot teammates." Sakura blinked in stunned silence for a moment before a surprised giggle escaped her. "I'll do my best, sensei." She continued to smile as she pushed off the wall and fell into step beside him. "You're my only good one," he grouched as they walked outside into the fading afternoon light. Irika, Sai, and Team 8 were all waiting for them outside, having also helped with the latest fruitless search. Yamato would have been there as well, but he was often called upon for construction needs these days and couldn't be with them every time they went out. The ANBU had taken to grumbling about being a glorified carpenter, but Kakashi thought the wood-type user took a certain amount of pride in being responsible for much of the rebuilding. In fact, Team 10 and Guy's team had volunteered on different occasions as well. Not that it had done any good, but Kakashi appreciated the extra hands and eyes. They probably would have had a lot more volunteers if the village hadn't been stretched so thin in the reconstruction. Villagers and other shinobi were constantly asking how the progress was and if there was anything they could do to help. It was touching and disheartening at the same time, to hear their concern but have to tell them the same thing each time. Speaking of Guy, just as Kakashi was telling his impromptu team, once again, to go home and get some rest, an unmistakable voice rang through the air, "Eternal rival." The copy-nin sighed as a large hand clamped down on his shoulder and pulled him close. "I see from your unyouthful faces that the search was again unsuccessful. But do not despair, my rival. Team Guy has come to cheer you up." Kakashi might have imagined it, but he swore he heard the softest, "Oh dear," come from Irika amongst the myriad of snickers from the younger shinobi. The rest of Guy's team walked up then, led by a very enthusiastic Rock Lee. "Yes. Sensei has brilliantly deduced that you may be in need of distraction and joyful company." Therefore, they were spared any more exclamation points by Tenten slapping a hand over Lee's mouth and smiling exasperatedly. "We're taking you all for barbecue. Ino, Choji, and Shikamaru are all waiting for us. We better hurry before Choji gets too impatient." She released Lee and he immediately grabbed Kiba and Shino, dragging them along enthusiastically. "Precisely. We will make an entire night of merriment, or I shall do 500 push-ups with each of you on my back." Hinata looked over at her cousin Niji with some concern. "Does he mean 500 push-ups for each of us? Or 500 push-ups with all of us on his back at once?" "Let's just go and look happy so we do not have to find out," Niji said and followed Lee. Sakura turned to Tenten smiling amusedly. "We know this is a pity dinner, but it's free food so it's appreciated." Kiba hollered back, "Get the lead out you three." Sakura threw him a look she had to have learned from Tsunade, but walked side by side with Tenten toward the restaurant, nudging a rather bewildered-looking Sai along as he muttered to Tenten, "But how would push-ups help anyone feel joy?" Turning back she called, "Are you three coming?" Irika answered first as Kakashi was currently being smothered with brotherly affection from Guy. "You go ahead. I have some things to take care of." Guy cut him off by grabbing the academy teacher with the arm he wasn't hugging Kakashi with. "Quite right, Irika-sensei. You, my eternal rival, and I will be commencing our joyful evening in a different location." Then Guy's voice lowered to a more normal octave as he said, "You, sensei, have also toiled in the search for young Naruto and deserve a few drinks, yes?" Irika seemed to notice the tone of sincerity in Guy's request, but an unsure glance at Kakashi made him mumble, "Oh, that's nice of you, Guy-san, but..." Kakashi grabbed the front of Irika's chunin vest before he could finish. "You are not leaving me alone with this man and alcohol, got it?" He didn't care if Irika felt awkward as all hell around him. Kakashi needed backup. Sane backup. "I am well, yes?" Irika sputtered, much to Guy's approval. "Excellent!" Guy exclaimed and began walking in the opposite direction the kids had just gone, and Kakashi could hear those brats laughing. They weren't even hiding it. "Then our joyful evening can begin in earnest." When they got to the bar, Irika felt a little guilty for doubting Guy earlier. He spotted Kurenai as soon as he walked in, and she waved at him. Since the pregnancy she had been helping to restore the academy, and they'd always gotten on well. She was sitting next to Asuma, who had amazingly foregone the cigarettes while he was in the presence of his very pregnant wife, probably paranoid about secondhand smoke affecting the baby. Enko was there, too, staring at Kurenai's bulging stomach in mild fascination as they walked up. Guy released Irika as soon as they walked in, but kept a firm, experienced hold on Kakashi, apparently for fear he would escape. Guy was shouting something about the excellence of youthful gatherings when Irika felt another arm drape around him and heard a voice say, "Well, it only took Might Guy to get Irika-sensei into a bar." "Who knew?" "Hi, Kotetsu," Irika said, shoving his arm off. "Where's Izumo?" "Probably washing his hands in the bathroom," Kotetsu replied, "or cleaning the bathroom in order to wash his hands. He's been in there long enough." Irika shook his head. Guy seems to think the search party was in need of cheering up. He pointed at where Guy was shoving Kakashi into a seat next to Asuma. "He's not the only one," Kotetsu said and led the way to the table. "You've been walking around like someone stole your favorite student." Which they kind of did. So, it's understandable. "Thanks, Ko," Irika grumbled as they both sat down, Irika next to Anko and Kotetsu saving a seat for Izumo. Kakashi was across from him but thankfully indirectly so they wouldn't be required to interact too much if they didn't want to. Irika was pretty sure Kakashi got enough of him when they were out hunting. "You're welcome," Ko said and smiled unabashed. Rolling his eyes, Irika turned away to greet the others but couldn't because he was almost immediately smothered by Anko who could, at times, rival Guy in enthusiasm. She had latched onto him and now Irika's face was dangerously close to her cleavage, and while he considered her a friend, this was a little too close for his liking. "Does this mean I get to get Irika drunk?" she asked excitedly as Irika tried to extract himself from her hold without touching anything that might be considered offensive and get him killed. "Anko, let him go," Kurenai laughed, "before the poor man has an up-close and personal experience." Anko looked down as if surprised to see Irika smashed up against her chest even though it was her arms holding him there. He wishes," she snickered, but released him. "Hey Guy. Let me help get the drinks. I want to get Mr. Tight-Ass drunk." And with that she climbed over the table, and was gone with Guy to the bar. Kurenai shook her head after her fellow jounin. "Irika, maybe you should run for it now, before she gets back. And spoil her fun?" Asuma teased. "I'd be interested to see a drunk Irika myself." "I'll be fine," Irika told Kurenai. "Anko's easy enough to distract, especially when she's drinking." "How have you been?" "Pregnant," Kurenai answered bluntly, "but happy." "How's the school coming along?" "It's mostly rebuilt now," Irika said. "We'll be able to hold classes there soon. Which is good because I'm running out of places for the kids to safely destroy." Kurenai laughed, and they chatted until Guy and Anko came back with what looked like half the alcohol content of the bar balanced on one tray. "Alright, Ruka," Anko slammed a glass full of something viciously green down in front of Irika. "Start with that and we'll go from there." "Who else?" "Byarik. "I really hope Irika-sensei is okay," Sakura said skeptically after a while. He'd seemed pretty panicked when they parted ways back there. "Aw, he'll be fine," Tenten reassured her. "Guy-sensei will probably be too preoccupied trying to challenge Kakashi-sensei to traumatize him too much." "If you say so," Sakura murmured, picking at her meal. Choji, Kiba, and Rock Lee were going at their food like they'd been starving in the desert for months, Lee possibly having turned it into some eating contest, but she just wasn't all that hungry lately. Hinata seemed to be using her chopsticks as more for show as well. Ino nudged her pink-haired friend with her elbow. "Lighten up, forehead. You've been way too down lately." Sai, who was sitting on Ino's other side with a drawing pad in hand, looked up. I had thought Sakura's emotional response was most appropriate considering yet another of her teammates has gone missing, and we have no real leads, other than rumor to go on, as to where he might be or if he is even still alive. There was a small silence at the table until Kiba said, "You do know that this is supposed to cheer her up, right?" Ino chucked a pickle slice at Kiba before turning back to Sai. "Yes, Sai, thank you. But we're trying to take her mind off of that right now, got it? So, you really haven't gotten any further leads?" Niji asked. "Niji," Ino nearly shrieked. "It's okay," Sakura said, smiling as best she could. "I don't mind talking about it." Nevertheless, she was grateful when Shino spoke up. As Sai said, "We haven't much but rumor to go on." This last excursion was a bust as well. "Hey, don't be like that," Kiba said loudly from beside Choji. "Sometimes it just takes a while." He was patting Akamaru's head reassuringly and feeding the Nikin scraps. 6 months is more than a while, Kiba, Shikamaru said dismally. "None of you are rising to the challenge of cheering the fair Sakura," Lee said between bites. "At this rate we will be forced to extend our outing to the cake shop next door, if we are to succeed." "To be honest," Choji said, somewhat oblivious to Lee, "I would have expected Naruto to come back on his own by now. I guess he can't cause of the daimyo soldiers, but I dunno, it's weird for him." Shikamaru nodded and the others made noises of agreement. Sakura felt her gut clench painfully. Choji didn't realize it but he had just touched on one of her greatest fears since this whole thing started. What if Naruto didn't want to come back? She was staring down at her plate, and didn't realize she'd spoken out loud until the entire table went quiet and Hinata asked in a low voice, "Why wouldn't he, Sakura?" She wasn't sure how to answer, but she tried anyway. "Because we should if he didn't it was no good," so she paused and started again. Gathering her thoughts and trying to be blunt like Sai, "People keep telling me it's not like last time, with Sasuke." Saying it out loud hurt but she plowed on, trying to make them understand, and maybe it's not, but what if it is? What if Naruto doesn't want to come back? What if he hates us? Sakura's voice cracked on the last words and she paused, determined not to cry like some pre-genin. Hinata asked, just as softly as before, "Why would he hate us?" "Because we didn't help him." The words burst out of Sakura without her consent, and she was as stunned as the rest of the table at their force. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Shikamaru hunch in on himself and look away from her. Because we didn't help him, she said again, more controlled this time, he saved the village. He saved all our lives and we stood aside while they ran him out of his own home. He's been treated horribly his whole life because he's a Jinchuriki, and just when he managed to show the village he was more than that. More than some monster he's exiled. Sakura paused, took shaky breath and mumbled, I would hate us, if it were me. There was silence, and she felt so suddenly tired. Tired of searching, tired of wondering, just so tired. A small hand covered Sakura's where it was clenching her chopsticks on the table, and Hinata's voice said quietly, You are wrong. Sakura looked up sharply at Hinata who looked back at her just as steadily. You're wrong, Hinata said again, because Naruto loves us and this village. He may be angry and hurt, but he won't hate us. It takes much more than that to make Naruto hate. There was a ruckus at the other end of the table as Kiba practically climbed over it to put his hand on top of Hinata's. Yeah, he said. Stop worrying, we'll find him and he'll probably lead the way back home when we do. Agreed, Ino said cheerfully and slapped her hand over Kiba's. Lee was next, almost breaking someone's arm in his enthusiasm. Indeed. Or so help me, I will exile myself until I have found our wayward friend. Don't be so dramatic, Niji said, but was nearly pulled out of his seat when Tenten grabbed his hand and stuck in the pile on top of hers. Choji pinned it down with his and Shino slowly joined in as well. Sakura was slightly surprised when Sai placed his hand on top of theirs, saying, I am also a part of your team, Sakura. He smiled his small, genuine smile. We must look out for each other, yes? Shikamaru hesitated and looked as bored as ever when Sakura looked up at him, knowing her comment, and stung him in particular. Not that it had been her intention. She was thinking more about how she hadn't insisted on going anyway when he stopped them. The Nara met her eyes and Sakura smiled slowly. Put your hand in, you lazy bum. You're a part of this crowd no matter how troublesome you think it is. A smile tugged at his mouth as Shikamaru put his hand carefully on top of the pile. There, see? Ino said happily, now it's a good night. For a little while Irika actually thought it would be a good night. Enko had indeed been distracted by Guy challenging Kakashi to a drinking contest, at which point Enko proved to be the more interested contestant. Irika thought Kakashi looked as relieved as he felt to have the two keeping each other busy. Enko still shoved the odd drink in Irika's direction now and then, but if she knew he was pouring most of them into the potted plant next to the booth she didn't let on. Guy was currently passed out upside down in their booth, Enko using his stomach for a pillow as she also snoozed away. By now the little group were the only ones left in the bar. Kurenai was good company until she got too tired and Asuma suggested they turn in early. They'd left, and shortly after Irika realized that at some point he had lost track of Kotetsu and Izumo during the night. Irika was just wondering if he should go find his friends when he realized he was being stared at. Irika turned to see it was Kakashi watching him intently. It really amazed Irika how that one eye could pin him better than any two ever could, except Ibiki's, but the guy was specially trained, it didn't count. The academy teacher suddenly felt a little guilty. Between Kurenai, Kotetsu, and Izumo he's nearly forgotten the copy was there. Of course, at the same time he felt the guilt, he felt that familiar creeping wariness he'd felt around the silver-haired jounin ever since their first real meeting just before those disastrous Chunin exams years ago. Despite being in more and more contact with him because Irika insisted on being a part of the search for Naruto, the academy teacher still couldn't shake his hesitance around Kakashi, who was still staring at him. Is something wrong, Kakashi-san? Irika asked politely, hoping none of his wariness showed in his voice. You're sober, Kakashi said, sitting up a little straighter, losing any semblance of drunkenness he'd displayed a moment ago. Irika felt his eyebrow twitch. Mostly, yes, he actually felt a little tipsy. But he was okay with that. So are you, apparently. Enko will be so disappointed, Kakashi drawled, but continued to stare at Irika. It was beginning to creep him out. She'll bounce back. It's not the first time she's failed at getting my uptight ass drunk, Irika replied, looking Kakashi in the eye and deliberately asking, Is there something else, Kakashi-san? Kakashi's head tilted to the side, much like Irika had seen Packins do when he was thinking. The jounin seemed to skin Irika once more, his completely normal eye feeling somehow intrusive. You're weird, he said bluntly and nothing more. Irika blinked. Then he snorted a laugh, saying disbelievingly, You walked down the street reading porn and periodically told your genin team that you were late because you got lost on the road of life, but I'm weird. Kakashi barely reacted, only humming noncommittally, and started running his finger over the edge of an abandoned glass, making it hum too. You're not a tracker. I mean, you track well enough, as any ninja worth his title should, but it's not your specialty. Irika felt his own head tilt a bit as he tried to keep up with the copynin's train of thought. I'm afraid I don't. And yet you insist on coming, Kakashi went on as if Irika hadn't spoken. He was staring at the glass under his finger now, not looking at Irika. You insist on being in on every tracking party going after Naruto. Irika felt himself stiffen as he understood what Kakashi was talking about. Kakashi-san, are you trying to say that I'm hindering the mission in some way? And Irika felt suddenly worried. Kakashi blinked and looked up at Irika again. HM? No, nothing like that. Then is this about the Chunin exams? Irika asked, feeling his face heat up at the thought that a jounin like Kakashi probably didn't even remember that incident. Kakashi seemed to think on that a moment, Is that why you keep tiptoeing around me? Iruka sighed, bewildered by the other man as ever. That's not an answer, and I am hardly tiptoeing. Yes, you are, Kakashi said in slight amusement. What else do you call hardly speaking or moving or generally breathing too loudly when I'm nearby? Iruka shot the jounin a glare and immediately looked away. And he must have been a little more tipsy than he thought because he mumbled petulantly, right, I forgot. You know everything, before he could stop it. Just as he realized this had slipped out, Kakashi gave a derisive little snort and said, well, I would hope I know a little more than a Chunin Academy sensei of all things. There was a silence in which Kakashi's words only made it to his brain after they had already come out of his mouth, and the Kopnin could only watch in horror as the Iruka's entire body went rigid. Iruka was not looking at him as he took a deep breath and the color rose to his face, not in embarrassment this time but anger. Finally, Kakashi's brain decided to inform him that he really ought to do some damage control now because what the actual hell were you thinking? I wasn't. Thinking is your job, Kakashi thought back to his brain and then started to sputter. No, wait, that I didn't mean. When Iruka finally looked at him, and his eyes were hard and closed off. Kakashi shut his gaping mouth. Hataki-san, Iruka said evenly, and Kakashi didn't miss how he'd suddenly switched to his family name instead of his given. If I am not hindering the mission in any way, I see no reason not to continue on with your team. My reasons for doing so are my own. I hope that is enough for you. Now if you will excuse me. The Chunin could have been giving a mission report with that tone of voice, except Kakashi felt the temperature in the room go down about 10 degrees. Iruka stood and Kakashi was still trying to figure out how to extract his foot from his mouth when the teacher walked out of the bar and didn't look back. It took another minute before Kakashi nodded to himself and drummed his fingers on the table. Now, he said assuredly, now he really hates me. Hate may be a strong word for it. Asuma's voice came from behind Kakashi just as the man himself came into view, more like once bitten, twice shy, really. Well, twice bitten now. Asuma sat down next to Kakashi and lit a cigarette in Kurenai's absence. How much of that did you hear? Kakashi asked miserably. Enough, Asuma shrugged. This is why you're never called on for the more diplomatic missions, by the way. Kakashi grumbled something insulting under his breath and asked irritably, why are you back here? Kurenai forgot her purse. Asuma reached back into the booth and pulled out said bag. Anyone ever told you you're whipped? Yes, Asuma said cheerfully. Stop changing the subject. I don't want to talk about it, Kakashi growled. Kakashi, Asuma sighed, sitting forward and flicking some cigarette ash into the tray provided by the bar. Let me give you some friendly advice. Oh, spare me, I beg you, the other jounin groaned. Asuma rolled his eyes at the dramatics, but continued, look, Kurenai and Iruka are pretty good friends. Therefore, by default, I know a little about the guy, and I'm here to tell you, as long as you're in charge of searching for Naruto, who else would I let do it? Kakashi wondered out loud. Asuma ignored him. You're not gonna scare him off. I dunno why, but Iruka loves that kid like a brother. Yeah, Molly coddles him like a damn puppy, Kakashi grumbled under his breath, recalling many a time seeing Iruka walk Naruto home from practice or buying the boy ramen. Asuma scowled. Will you stop acting like a jealous girlfriend and listen? Kakashi's eye narrowed but he went quiet. Asuma nodded and went on. Iruka is a good guy, really. The old man held him in pretty high esteem, even. Asuma gave Kakashi an assessing look and said carefully, so don't worry about running him off. He'll be there when you need him. And he can be a damn good friend if you let him. He laughed then, trust me. Iruka managed to calm Kurenai when she got into one of her panics about the baby in 10 minutes flat. And he's still the record holder. Asuma snuffed out his cigarette and was rising to leave, little red handbag in tow, when Kakashi asked, why would I be worried about something like that? Running him off? And is it that obvious I was worried? The other man just shrugged. How should I know, Kakashi? I'm not your therapist. The cool night air did a lot to calm Iruka as he walked back to his apartment. He had been furious and righteously offended as he left the bar, but after a few blocks of crisp, fresh air, his anger had simmered down to mere brooding. Looking back, Iruka really didn't know what he had expected. The Chunin wasn't delusional enough to think that he was equal in any way with the famous Sharingan Kakashi, but Iruka did have to wonder what he had ever done to the jounin to deserve his derision every time they spoke. Granted, they'd only really spoken outside of obligatory interaction twice, but still, a little common courtesy wasn't too much to ask for, was it? Iruka shook his head, trying to erase Kakashi and his stupid opinions from his mind. It was already after midnight, and if he kept brooding he would never get any sleep. Sighing, he finally reached his new apartment building, as new as every other building on the street, and fished for his key as he climbed to his floor. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, once again noting how sparse his living space was, now that he was having to rebuild from scratch just like everyone else in the village practically. 6 months was a long time, but not enough to regain a lifetime of clutter, especially when he was missing a certain blonde to help make a mess. At that thought, Iruka paused at one of the doors in the hallway, carefully laying a hand on the knob. It was the door to the second bedroom that he'd insisted on having when he went apartment hunting. Reluctantly, he turned the knob and opened the door, looked inside and not for the first time wondered if the room was just wishful thinking on his part. Inside there was an extra futon and a tiny chest of drawers to one side, one wall sporting a poster Iruka had begged Tucci, the owner of Ichiraku's, to make for him of his ramen stand's logo. Tucci had gotten Ayam in on it, and she designed it herself. Anything for our favorite customer, she'd laughed at the time. It was Naruto's room. The one he didn't even know about yet. Before pain, Iruka had also had a 2-bedroom apartment. He'd gotten the place at a good rate and therefore had ignored the fact that he lived alone and didn't need the extra space. The extra bedroom had been used for storage until a certain genin decided to graduate in the most dramatic way possible and consequently carved a permanent place into Iruka's life. Iruka would never forget the days after Mizuki had stabbed him in the back, quite literally, and Naruto trying to help with his recovery. His kitchen had never quite recovered from Naruto's attempt at cooking. Naruto had also insisted on sleeping on Iruka's couch, because what if you need something in the middle of the night? You're supposed to be resting, you can't be wandering around in the middle of the night. Therefore Iruka had done the only logical thing he could. He sent Kotetsu and Izumo to buy an extra futon to put in the room and told Naruto to sleep in there from then on, whenever the urge struck him. Naruto had stared at that little futon and the other small pieces of furniture Iruka had placed in the room like they were holy treasures. Really? The boy had asked, nearly tearful. Are you sure? Yes, Naruto, Iruka had replied softly, ruffling the boy's hair. I'm really sure. And there was many a night Naruto would follow him home after training or ramen and sleep in that room. Some mornings Iruka would wake to find Naruto sound asleep even though he hadn't heard him come in during the night. When Naruto slept over, Iruka would always fix breakfast for them, turning down Naruto's offer to help because he didn't think he or his kitchen could handle it, and it was nice. It was the closest he'd come to family in a long time, and he liked to think that Naruto felt the same, so Iruka had a second bedroom again. But he could only hope that the one meant to fill it would be found. Iruka sighed again and closed the door, continuing on his way to his own bedroom. When he finally crawled into bed, his last thought before he finally drifted off was to wonder if Naruto was alright. If he was safe and warm and well fed, wherever he was. If he knew he still had a home to come back to. The next morning, Iruka awoke to banging. Very loud, insistent banging that was so worthy of Naruto that he thought for a brief second in between sleep and wakefulness that it was indeed the blonde at his front door. He realized that it couldn't be only a second before he made it to his front door, and wrenched it open to blink blearily at a blur of pink. Sakura? Iruka asked dumbly as the pink blur ran past him and into his bedroom. Get dressed, Iruka-sensei. Sakura shouted, Iruka following her into the bedroom and realizing that he dragged his blanket with him and nearly tripped over it to keep up. What dash? Why? He asked, rubbing his eyes and trying to figure out what time it was. One of his uniforms was flung at him, and when he caught them he focused back on Sakura. Sakura, who was looking at him with tears in her eyes and grin. We have a lead, she said, and that was all it took for Iruka to scramble into his uniform and race her out the door. Conan had not really found much humor in the world in a long time. A very long time. She figured it was understandable, considering Yahiko, her teammate and almost lover, was long gone. Sensei, the man she had once thought of as a father figure, had passed from this world as well. It didn't help that she had more than a little to do with that. Now Nagato, her last true friend in the world, was dead. She'd also had plenty to do when she got back to Amigakure, carrying out her former teammates, and now Uzumaki Naruto's dreams, of peace and alliance. Amigakure was under her rule now, albeit somewhat secretively, and she felt the weight of that dream of peace more than ever. But that is where she had put her faith, and there she would keep it, and play her part as best she could and maybe make up for some small fraction of the pain she had caused in the past. When Conan had gotten back to the Rain Village, she had taken pains to hide Nagato's body, laying him next to Yahiko. That masked man, Toby, would come for the Rinnegan, of that she was sure, and she had laid her traps for him, waiting. Showed that man a few scars for the corruption he had caused. She thought she had considered everything. There was, however, one obstacle she had not accounted for, and had deemed it damn laughable when it walked into her village. The daimyo's men looked almost as surprised as she felt when they issued their lord's command, and she had not only snorted in a very unladylike fashion, but had had a rather long and teary laughing fit right in front of them. Maybe she'd been a little more stressed than she'd realized. Or maybe it really was that ridiculous. Nevertheless, Conan composed herself quickly and, attempting to regain her blank, emotionless mask, faced the little black-clad men before her. Forgive me, she said primly, allow me to clarify. The daimyo of the land have sent you, she pointed a dainty finger at the men with utmost contempt, to remove me from my village. Her hand retracted to rest on her own chest in the most queenly manner she could muster. Because he is under the impression that I am a Jinchuriki? The black uniformed man in front of her was wearing a mask that covered most of his face, but his eyes were revealed, and in them she saw every ounce of fear she'd ever inspired. Staring back at her, we will use force if we have to. She almost impressed at how steady his voice held. Almost. Conan, being a founding member of the Akatsuki and having studied Jinchuriki for years, probably could have expounded for hours to these men about exactly how wrong the daimyo were in that aspect, but she found she really didn't care enough to bother. She had more important things to worry about, and if these idiots, who wanted to take her out of her village and treat her like some common flunky they could intimidate, if these kinds of people had a death wish, she was more than happy to oblige. On second thought, maybe she should refrain from actually killing them. Dreams of peace and all that. Even if they were stupid enough to take on Lady Angel. Konan nodded to herself, making her decision, and then cocked her eyebrow at the daimyo's men. Listen carefully, all of you, she said, taking the diplomatic approach first. It had worked for Naruto anyway. You and the feudal lords are mistaken. I am not a Jinchuriki, nor can any such being be found in this village. I must ask you to leave, now. The one that seemed to be the leader had the nerve to step toward her. We have our orders. You will leave or you and your village will face dire consequences. Oh, really? She wondered distantly. How quaint. Very well then. Konan paused and raised her arms. Force it is. And flapping sheets of paper filled the room. As she did this, something rather surprising happened, and for a second time that day, Konan was very nearly impressed with these foolish men. 2 of them, moving with ninja-level speed. Although Konan doubted these men were traditionally trained in the way of the shinobi, they obviously had some competence in the skills of one. 2 of the black-uniformed men grabbed the previously unnoticed attachments to their backpacks and fire spewed out. Her first round of paper went up in smoke almost immediately, and as Konan decided maybe she would kill these idiots, another of the men pulled a tube out of his belt and blew through one end, spraying a barrage of poison samban at her. She dodged these easily enough, but a second later was almost caught in the shoulder by a flying projectile about the size of an apple. Her paper took care of this by reaching out and lobbing it away, and she turned to see yet another of the men holding what looked like a miniaturized cannon on his hip. She didn't have much time to contemplate that, because as soon as the apple-sized object the tiny cannon had shot at her hit the wall and bounced off, it began to secrete some sort of gas. Konan knew was poisonous just by the green tinge of it. She sent her paper out to it again, wrapping it and containing the gas, and also realizing that although these men were not shinobi in the strictest sense, they had access to much of the tools shinobi used, and some they didn't. Advanced weaponry. Shinobi in general preferred not to rely too heavily on tools, unless they were a specialist, as such things tended to break or get lost, and often the only thing a person had to fall back on was their own body. These men were relying almost solely on weaponry, and they had access to some of the best. They were still no match for her. Konan went for the flamethrowers first, allowing some of her paper to be burned and distract the men carrying the packs, but another wave of sheets dodged and began to wrap the men from head to foot. In no time they were unable to use their flames, or they would risk setting themselves on fire. The leader was shouting, now that their main line of defense against her was unreachable, but was soon silenced as Konan swiftly cocooned him away as well. Konan then turned to the other men remaining. I am beginning to lose my patience, gentlemen. Kindly show yourselves out, or I will have to show you out myself. With a flick of the wrist she raised the 3 cocooned men and allowed them to drift toward the open window. Without their leader, the other men, though they still outnumbered her significantly, quickly quailed and ran. No honor among the daimyo's men apparently, allowing her 3 prisoners to drop to the floor, bruised perhaps, but safe. She unwrapped the leader's face enough for him to hear and answer her. I am going to ask you a question, she said, looming over him, watching his eyes widen as he squirmed inside his prison. You say you are after Jinchuriki. Then tell me, what has become of Uzumaki Naruto of the Leaf? Naruto was lost. He wasn't sure how he managed it as he was still in Fire Country, but the forest he was in was beginning to all look the same. Except that tree. He was pretty sure he'd seen that tree at least 3 times before. Great, not only was he lost, he was going in circles. It had only been a few weeks since he'd left the village, and, had Naruto not been a shinobi and seen some pretty messed up stuff in his short life, he could have easily labeled them the worst weeks of his life. But he was a shinobi, and therefore he considered his situation bearable if not comfortable. The one time he tried to show his real face in another village, despite it being a civilian village, he'd been swarmed by the daimyo's men and he'd had to run for it again. Apparently his face was one they knew by heart. Luckily a simple henge was enough to fool them, but ever since the daimyo's new law, people were suspicious of any new face in town, making it difficult for him to move through populated areas. He was suddenly really glad Choji had once decided to give him a friendly lecture in food gathering, because not only could he not easily get into town to buy food, he was running low on funds. He'd been sticking to the wilderness ever since, except now he was lost. And alone, that niggling voice told him, don't forget alone. Shut up, he thought back. Funny how they haven't come to look for you. I said, shut up, and Naruto clamped down and silenced it. He was just contemplating what good retracing his steps would do when he heard it. Naruto stopped, then leapt into a tall tree and listened for another noise. Something was moving out there, and it wasn't human. As he listened closer he realized there was more than one. He moved back, blended into the shadows of the tree and waited, hoping whatever it was would just pass by. Naruto watched as a shadow approached through the trees, silent and stealthy, four-legged and furry with eyes that glowed in the early morning darkness. A wolf. If there was more than one it was probably a pack then, and Naruto felt a little safer knowing wolves weren't prone to climbing. When the creature stepped out into the open though, Naruto had to reevaluate his assessment. The beast could be better described as a wolf dog, reminding Naruto more of the familiars in the Inuzuka clan than of their wild cousins. Upon this realization the blonde tensed all the more, wondering if this meant there was another shinobi nearby. As he watched, the wolf dog, covered in gray fur, its chest and feet white, sniffed the ground around his tree and lifted its head to sniff the air. It was about the same size as Akamaru, and when it raised its eyes to lock onto Naruto's, they held the same nearly human intelligence. Naruto froze. Had the creature been looking for him? It was still staring at him with its head tilted curiously, and Naruto figured there was no sense in hiding if the thing knew he was there. He stepped out, unsure, and without really knowing how one was to address a random intelligent beast while they were lost in the forest, said ever so gracefully, hey? If a wolf dog could roll their eyes, this one did. Then it only continued to stare at him expectantly. What do you want? Naruto asked, getting irritated. He could still hear the others milling around just out of view, mere shadows in a forest full of them. I'm not coming down, he added. The wolf dog cocked its head and proceeded to sit heavily down on its hindquarters with a light thud. It gave him a look that clearly said, well, you can't stay up there forever, buddy. Naruto glared for a moment. The last thing he needed right now was a sassy fuzzbucket. That was probably hungry. Finally he sighed and looked the thing right in the eye. If you or any of your friends tried to eat me, I will Rasengan you into a fur coat, got it? The wolf dog made a scoffing noise through its nose that seemed to say, same to you, pal. Naruto rolled his eyes and jumped down from the tree, landing lightly on his feet in front of the animal, poised to run at the first sign of attack. None came. However, more of them emerged, cautiously making their way over to Naruto, and what he assumed was their leader. Or alpha. Or whatever. The pack was all shades of brown and gray, blending into the trees and forest around them. Naruto counted 11 of them, 12, including the first one to come out. He backed away but only managed to back into one of them, the smallest one. This one, with mouse-brown fur, gave him a little nudge to the back of the knees and a kind lick to the hand as if to reassure him, then began to sniff. In fact, they were all sniffing and snuffling at him as the leader watched on. Eventually they all seemed to come to some conclusion or other and looked at each other, that same almost human intelligence shining in their eyes, and then looked to the gray leader. It was one of the more bizarre things Naruto had witnessed, but by now he'd learned to roll with these sorts of things. The pack seemed to have some silent conversation until, finally, the leader nodded and stood, looking Naruto in the eye again. It jerked its head as if to say, follow us and be quick about it, before it turned and dashed through the trees. Naruto had a split second to ask himself if he was really about to follow a bunch of canines through an unfamiliar area before the others took off as well. Only the little mouse one stayed behind to push its head into the back of Naruto's knees, pushing him in the direction the pack had run. It turned pleading puppy eyes up to him when he didn't budge. Oh, what the hell, Naruto sighed and started after the rest. Why not? Once in a while the leader would stop and sniff the air, maybe change course slightly and keep running. But it wasn't even 10 minutes later that it, and the rest of the pack stopped, and went completely still. When the pack went silent, Naruto soon heard something else in the distance but couldn't really make out what it was. The gray wolf dog turned to him again and jerked its head in the direction of the sound. Well, dummy, get moving, haven't got all day. Naruto was really starting to get annoyed with this mutt, but it hadn't tried to eat him yet, and seemed to want his help. So he moved closer to the sound. The wolf dogs didn't follow him, but some did shift nervously and whine, as if in anticipation. Naruto was again thinking how ridiculous, and probably really foolish, but he was too used to living up to that reputation to stop now. This whole thing was when the sound became clearer. Sobbing. Someone was crying. He quickened his pace, but before he could get much closer a voice said, barely audible because of its distance and weakness, "Who's there?" Naruto stopped momentarily, wondering how anyone could have heard him coming at that distance when the voice came again. "I know you're th there." There was a rustle like someone was scrabbling through the dry leaves on the forest floor. "I'll hit you." The voice sounded like a young girl's, dry and cracked as it was. From a distance Naruto saw a limb rise up from behind a thick tree, like the person had picked it up to threaten him with it. Naruto finally closed the distance as silently as he could and saw a sight that would have been comical if it wasn't also so sad. The owner of the voice was a girl all right, and she did indeed have a tree branch in her hands ready to swing. Naruto, however, wondered why she was facing the tree so threateningly, instead of him, as he was standing behind it just to the side where she could have easily seen him. That's also when he noticed the state she was in. The arms that held up the impromptu weapon were too thin and shaking, her dress and bare feet were dirty and torn. The girl's white hair hung long over her face and shoulders, obscuring her face and making Naruto wonder how she could see at all through that mass of hair. "Hey," Naruto finally said quietly, trying to be non-threatening, but caused the girl to startle so badly she screamed and whacked the tree with all her might, which was pathetically not much. "Whoa, wait. I'm not." She realized she hadn't hit him and started to sputter incoherently. "Why you get away? Just get away." She began to swing her branch from side to side wildly, actually managing to aim in his general direction this time, and Naruto decided to move before the poor girl took her own eye out. "Calm down," he said before easily grabbing the branch and pulling it out of her weak grasp. She'd started to cry again and turned like she would run away, but Naruto caught her arm as gently as he could without hurting her. "I'm not going to hurt you." She turned back to him again and desperately tried to swing at him with her other arm, but Naruto caught that too. She thrashed in his grip, and as her hair was thrown back Naruto saw her face, and suddenly things got much more confusing. Her eyes were completely blank, just white orbs in their sockets. The girl was blind. "Let go!" She was screaming again, fighting with all her tiny might to get away. "Will you calm down? If I wanted to hurt you I could have already," Naruto tried to reason. Her thrashing weakened by the second and he was hoping she would wear herself out so he could talk to her. But then the gray wolf dog appeared again and the girl's head, impossible as it seemed, swiveled to lock her sightless eyes on the creature. She screamed yet again and redoubled her efforts to get away. They're back. They'll kill me, let go. She managed to knee Naruto in the stomach somehow, and he grunted but thankfully kept hold of her. This time he twisted her, still trying to be as gentle as possible as he could feel the fragile bones in her tiny wrist, and pinned her back to his chest, putting a hand over her mouth and holding both her wrists with his other hand. Quickly he said, "Stop, please. No one's going to hurt you. Not me and not the dogs." Naruto looked up at the gray wolf dog standing a few feet away now with its head lowered pitifully as it watched the girl struggle weakly. I think Naruto started as he watched the animal move slowly towards them so as not to startle her. I think it wants to help. It brought me here to help. The girl stilled after a few more jerks for freedom, but continued to shake like a leaf. I'm gonna take my hand away, Naruto said. I just want to talk, I promise. Please don't start screaming again. The girl nodded hesitantly, and he lowered his hand and loosened his grip slightly. She practically went limp as she started crying again. Naruto had no clue what to do. The poor thing seemed to be half out of her mind. I'm Uzumaki Naruto, he said, trying to calm her. Naruto shifted and set her against a tree so she was facing him now. After a moment's thought he started pulling ration bars and his canteen from his pack. She looked like she hadn't eaten in a while. What's your name? She shook her head but didn't speak, only folding her arms against the chill in the air, a choked hiccup escaping her now and then. Her head still hadn't turned away from the wolf dog, apparently considering it a bigger threat than Naruto even though it hadn't made a single threatening move toward them since it walked up. Okay, never mind, Naruto mumbled and pulled an extra blanket out, too, draping it over her shoulders. She jumped and looked back at him then, and Naruto wondered how in the world she knew where beings of flesh and blood were but had managed to hit a tree she seemed unable to see. Why are you out here all alone? Are you lost? Naruto asked, scratching the back of his head awkwardly. She shook her head again and curled into herself and the blanket, away from him. Naruto thought she wasn't going to answer again, and sighed. Shaking his head, Naruto decided to set about making a fire, hoping she wouldn't try to run off. Her feet were cut up and scraped pretty badly and he was impressed she'd been able to move on them at all. Then she said, barely over a whisper, he said we were just going for a walk. Her voice sounded like rocks in a blender. Naruto turned back and her sightless eyes were on the wolf dog again, which had inched closer, still watching the girl with an oddly pained expression on its doggy face. A walk? Naruto prompted, stepping toward her again. The men came, she said, ignoring him it seemed, the strangers that smelled bad. They talked and then Ko said we were going for a walk. Then he was gone, his light went out, she was frozen now, transfixed on the dog watching her, looking rather like a cornered animal herself. They wanted the wolves to kill me. They protect the village, they kill the threats. Her wide eyes turned and seemed to lock onto Naruto next, and he almost stepped back from her blank eyes. You smell nice. And then she fainted. Naruto snapped out of whatever daze he was in and caught her before her head hit the ground, but as he did the blanket slipped from her shoulders. He was pulling it up, wrapping her more securely in it when he looked down and saw the mark on her collarbone. It was a small seal. Naruto blinked in disbelief, not fully understanding what it could be. He looked back up at the wolf dog who had come closer now and snuffled almost lovingly at the girl's hair, and back down at the seal. She couldn't be, he whispered, and the mutt looked at him curiously. Jinchuriki? Missing? Madara didn't really like to repeat himself or others, but this time he made an exception. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki is missing? White Setsa hummed lazily. I was a little surprised too. The leaf is awfully protective of him, but it seems he's been driven out of the village, and now they don't even know where he's run off to. And I take it, Madara clarified, we do not know where he is either? Afraid not. White Setsa shrugged and then laughed. Only so much even I can see. You'll never guess the reason though. Madara waited. When Setsa just stood there grinning like an idiot he snapped, I appreciate it if you would enlighten me. White Setsa's smile faltered but he said, the daimyo are after the Jinchuriki now, too. Not to capture, they just want them out of the villages. The Eight-Tails is missing, also, for the same reason. Madara was silent for a long time and Setsa began to fidget. Perhaps, Madara said at last, making White Setsa freeze, the daimyo have done me a favor. White Setsa blinked. How so? We've lost the Jinchuriki. Yes, Madara said quietly. But if we can find them outside their villages and unprotected we will have far less opposition. White Setsa smiled in understanding. Would you like me to start looking, sir? And be quick about it, Zetsu, Madara replied. The Kages will no doubt be searching as well by now. White Setsa nodded and was gone. Madara drummed his fingers on his chair's arm. What an interesting turn of events. Gaara finished reading the latest message from Tsunade and sighed. Still nothing on Naruto, huh? Kankuro asked and sat down next to him. Gaara wordlessly shook his head. Nothing. They didn't even have a lead yet. It's been too long, Gaara said. If any of our ninja had been missing this long we would have considered them dead or gone rogue. He said it in monotone but the words felt like thorns on his tongue. Don't be like that, Kankuro replied, settling back in his seat. Naruto's got no reason to go rogue, and do you really think he'd be that easy to kill? I should go after him. Gaara ignored his brother and repeated the same sentiment he'd held for months now. I should be helping. Gaara, Kankuro sighed in exasperation, we've had this talk. You can't. He came after me, Gaara replied simply. Kankuro grit his teeth, and I and the rest of the village are eternally grateful to him for that, but it's different the other way around. You're the Kage. Gaara huffed in annoyance and stood, starting to pace, but Kankuro kept talking. Your responsibility is to the village, the puppet master said patiently. You can't go gallivanting off across the continent to look for one shinobi. Another village's shinobi at that. We could send someone. Who? Kankuro asked. I hate to say it, but do you really think our people can do anything that Konoha hasn't already done? And while we're at it, why not call up the Raikuge and ask if he'd like a few sannin helping find his brother too? You can't meddle in another village's affairs, Gaara, no matter how well-intentioned. I know, Gaara said irritably, turning away from Kankuro, feeling peevish. Yes, thank you, I know. His brother was quiet a few moments before Gaara felt a strong hand on his shoulder. Look, I get it, Kankuro said, Naruto's a friend. If the leaf asks we'll help, but if and when that happens, we just can't. The Kage felt his shoulders sag miserably, and he was glad Kankuro was the only one in the room with him. He knew his brother was right, but it still felt like the universe was mocking him somehow. He was Kage. Gaara had finally proven himself to be more than the killer his village thought of him as, had risen above even his own expectation, and was happy for it. But for the same reason he could not help the friend who had inspired him to such things. Gaara had heard how Naruto had saved the leaf, how he too, had finally shown them, all of them, what a Jinchuriki wanted most in life. That they were more than the beasts they held. That they were different from the monster. Gaara had been so proud for his friend. And then this law. For just a moment, when the daimyo's men had explained to him that he was exempt from the new command because he'd been a good little Kage. Even though Gaara projected calm and placidity, he wished he could go back to his murderous ways just to crush those idiots. He'd pushed them out of his village much like the other Kages had done, and with about as much kindness. Gaara had proven himself, Naruto had proven himself, and here were the lords of the land trying to reduce them back to the status of a beast. On second thought, the universe wasn't just mocking Gaara but Naruto as well. I'm sorry, Gaara whispered. For what? Kankuro gave his shoulder a little push. Wanting to help a friend ain't something to be sorry for, genius. Gaara smiled a little at that and didn't even protest when Kankuro thumped him a little too hard on the back, strolled out of the room, and teased. Alright, we got stuff to do, Kage-sama, let's go. Rolling his eyes and walking after his brother, Gaara felt the smile slide off his face as he secretly hoped the leaf would ask. It was a cool day in Konoha when Iruka hurried out his door, barely bothering to lock it, and followed Sakura through the streets. It was still sunny though, and the school teacher decided to take that as a good omen. In her rush, Sakura took a shortcut that had them ducking through several unfinished structures and dodging construction workers. But Iruka couldn't bring himself to ask her to slow down. He hadn't asked her anything, in fact, about the lead or why it had her so excited. He just knew this one had to be different if the way Sakura was acting was any indication. It had to be different. They didn't slow down until they reached the newly rebuilt Hokage Tower. Sakura paused outside long enough to straighten out her clothes and compose herself, and Iruka did the same. Although he got the impression he wasn't the first person Sakura had run the message to that morning. His suspicion was confirmed when they walked into the Tsunade's office and Iruka saw Team 8 already there, as well as Captain Yamato, waiting anxiously. Tsunade was behind her desk looking testier than usual, but spared Sakura a nod and Iruka a slightly confused glance. Abruptly, Iruka wondered if Tsunade actually sent for him, or if Sakura made an assumption, but the Hokage said nothing, only continuing to scowl at the man across from her. That's when Iruka noticed the bespectacled, gray-haired man and a young boy, maybe a few years younger than Naruto. Iruka had never seen either of them before. It seemed Sakura had. Tazuna-san? She looked at the old man, who tipped his hat at her in welcome. Inari? The boy waved and smiled broadly. What are you two doing here? Oh good, the older man, Tazuna, grumbled Sakura. Well, I'm trying to explain to the Hokage here, the man shot a glare at Tsunade, and Iruka thought he heard the Godame's teeth grind together, and wondered if the man knew he was flirting with death, that I know where Naruto is and that she needs to get a move on before those fool lords beat her there. Gramps, the boy Inari warned. How do you know them? Iruka whispered to Sakura, pushing down his own curiosity at the man's claim. They would hear it soon enough. Tazuna was Team 7's first real mission. The master bridge builder, Sakura answered lowly, a distant look in her eyes. Naruto told you about Wave Country, right? Tazuna and his grandson Inari have been helping restore the village. Naruto had told him about Wave. Iruka cringed a bit at the memory. Like I said, Tsunade was saying evenly, sounding like this Tazuna character was about to fly through a wall as she had to explain herself one more time. I have to gather a team before I can send anyone, and not everyone I called is here yet. Her eyes flicked to Iruka again, but again she made no comment. Well, are you having engraved invitations made, woman? Tazuna practically shouted. Gramps, Inari warned again. Just before Tsunade could come up with a proper death for the old man, the door opened, and in walked Kakashi and Shikamaru behind him. Oh, look at that, Tsunade said, settling back in her seat again with a slightly impressed look. You decided to show up on time, brat. Someone marked the calendar. Kakashi rolled his one visible eye and then locked it onto Tazuna and Inari, as he leaned against the door he'd just walked through. It was casual enough, but Iruka got the sense the copy was actually standing guard. Alright, Tazuna-san, we're all here, Tsunade said with mock cheerfulness, then turned serious. I want you to tell these people exactly what you told me. Again? I already explained it to you and again to Hataki over there, Tazuna growled, rubbing his head under his hat. At the murderous look Tsunade threw him and the urgent, Gramps, come on, from Inari, the old man held his hands up in surrender. Alright. Tazuna sighed and went quiet for a moment as he gathered his thoughts to begin his explanation. Well, I suppose I should start by saying I'm from Wave Country, as some of you already know. My village is mainly civilian, we don't have much in the way of proper ninjas to speak of. I tell you that so you can see why the daimyo's men have left us pretty much alone as far as this Jinchuriki business is concerned. Their men came in 6 months ago to make sure Zabuza, that wacko who liked to call himself the demon of the mist or what have you, was really dead, and then they left. Since then, from what Tsunami, my daughter, writes, he rifled through his pocket and pulled a wrinkled letter out. We've been getting quite a few refugees in the area, and that's where Naruto is. Kiba suddenly cut in, looking ready to sprint out the door in the direction of Wave Country. Iruka heard Shino's small sigh at his teammate, and Hinata's expression became slightly pained. Hush you. Let me finish, Tazuna said as Tsunade sent Kiba a glare for the interruption. But to answer your question, well, Tazuna paused and shifted awkwardly. He ain't in Wave, but he's gotta be in the area. See, we've been getting some weird new trade partners. The merchants and sailors saying they've had orders coming in from a neighboring island. He trailed off after a moment, seeming reluctant to continue. Why is that strange? Yamato prompted calmly. Your village is built on trade, isn't it? Yeah, Inari piped up in Tazuna's stead, except the island Gramps is talking about is haunted. Akamaru whined at Kiba's hip. Yamato gave the boy a bemused look as Tazuna swatted Inari over the head with his letter. Inari, you know very well that's just old fisherman talk. Inari rubbed his head and pouted. But even you said what happened there in the last great shinobi wars was a tragedy. Every ninja in the room except Kakashi and Tsunade perked up at that. It was, Tazuna said, suddenly very sober as he looked around at the rest of the room. That's because the island I'm talking about is Yuzushiogakure. Iruka felt the air in his lungs freeze. Yamato seemed to have a similar reaction and Shikamaru's eyes widened infinitesimally. Sakura's brow furrowed. I know that name. Well, someone explain it to me, Kiba suddenly burst out, making Akamaru grumble quietly at his master's agitation. I don't get what this has to do with Naruto. Calm down, Kiba, Shino said quietly as if this was a constant mantra for him. Yuzushiogakure, the land of whirlpools, Iruka decided to speak up, as he knew how many history lessons Kiba had skipped in his days at the academy, was once a strong ally of the land of fire. They were highly skilled in sealing jutsu and because of that their village was wiped out in the last shinobi war and much of their culture and secrets lost. There were survivors, but not many and they'd been scattered ever since. Iruka decidedly left out the part about the Uzumaki clan, the details of which Iruka was not well versed. A look from Tsunade told him this was a good move on his part. Tazuna nodded soberly and went on. It was a bloody day in history, I remember. And out of respect, or perhaps more so, fear, people have been leaving that island well enough alone all this time. Till now anyway. As for what it's got to do with Naruto, Tazuna shot a look at Kiba who seemed on the verge of sticking his tongue out at the old man. It's here. He held the letter up once again, and at Yamato's outstretched hand, passed it to him. Tsunami wrote me again. Says she was out in the market and swears she saw Naruto in the street. When she tried to talk to him though, well you see there. Yamato was passing the letter around and when Sakura got it Iruka read over her shoulder. I'm writing you this quickly in hopes of catching you before you leave Konoha, and I'm sure they'll want to know what I saw as soon as possible. I saw Uzumaki Naruto today in the market. I remember you writing me and saying that he was missing, but I swear I saw him right in the middle of the street. There was no mistaking him even though he's older now, obviously, but I'd recognize that hair and those marks on his cheeks anywhere. I called out to him, and I know he heard me because when I called his name he startled something awful. I think he recognized me but then he ran like I was the Undertaker coming for him. I chased after him for a bit but he just disappeared around a corner, and I couldn't find him again. I don't know what to think, but just for a second, Dad, he looked so frightened. You need to let the people in Konoha know. I think he's living out there on Whirlpool. I've written to you about that island already. From what little I saw of him he looked well though. Make sure you tell them that. Tell them he was alright from what I could see. I'm sure they're worried. I hope this letter gets to you soon. Tell Inari I love him and not to worry. Iruka felt an unprecedented surge of relief when he read that Naruto was okay, even if it was the most cursory of diagnosis from a woman he didn't even know. Sakura passed the note to Hinata who held it up for the rest of her team to read, Kiba nearly knocking the poor girl over, as Tazuna continued, and that's pretty much the gist of it. Tsunami says she thinks Naruto is staying in Whirlpool, and I believe her. Wouldn't be surprised if he's got a few other refugees out there with him, but I won't go so far as to say that for sure. Tazuna paused and scratched his chin. Smart though. Hiding out on an island everyone else is too spooked to set foot on. Alright, Kiba said, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Looks like we're heading to haunted Whirlpool Island. Kiba, Hinata whispered in warning, be more respectful. Not quite, Tsunade cut in and stood. While I do want you to investigate the island, you'll be going to Wave Country first, to Tazuna's village. We don't know for sure what's on Whirlpool yet, and I don't want you walking in unprepared. Get intel first, then go. Understood? Her last word was aimed with a pointed glare directly at Kiba, who quailed a bit and nodded with the rest of them. Good, Tsunade went on. Now the team for this mission will consist of Team 8 and Team Kakashi, with the exception of Sai. At this point Tsunade grumbled something about Danzo and where he could shove his own damn agenda, but cleared her throat and continued professionally. Shikamaru has also volunteered to go. The way she said it, and the way Shikamaru looked so innocently bored made Iruka wonder what the Nara had said to be put on this mission. Tazuna and Inari, here will accompany you, and Iruka-sensei, Kakashi, who had been nearly forgotten up till this point, spoke up. Tsunade went quiet as she raised an eyebrow at the Jounin. Oh yeah, I was wondering why he was here, since I didn't even send for him. Oh well, that's awkward. Iruka felt heat rise to his face and tried to force it back down. I didn't. But then Sakura turned to Kakashi looking scandalized. You told me Lady Tsunade sent for Iruka-sensei too, you liar. Kiba snorted a laugh and Yamato rubbed his head like he was getting a headache. Kakashi ignored Sakura's outburst and said to Tsunade, I need him alone. I need him here to oversee the academy re-establishment. Tsunade countered and Iruka suddenly remembered that was happening in the next few weeks. Iruka-sensei is one of the senior teachers. He's worked on this just as much as the search. From the corner of his eye Iruka saw Yamato give him a rather impressed look. Iruka felt the blush threatening again. Surely somebody at the academy can cover for him, Kakashi said blandly, waving a hand dismissively. Iruka makes very good notes. I know, he's inked over many a mission report of mine. Iruka was looking from Kakashi to Tsunade and back trying to figure out what in the world had suddenly gotten into the copying to be fighting for him like this. Listen, Iruka started but was cut off yet again. He's put just as much work into trying to find Naruto as the rest of us. Not to mention Sai is apparently unable to join us, so I'll need a replacement, Kakashi said over Iruka's sputtering. I'm hardly a replacement for Sai, Iruka blurted without thinking and Sakura gave him a hard poke in the ribs with her elbow. Kakashi didn't acknowledge either of them as he went on. I think Iruka-sensei deserves to go, don't you, Lady Hokage? The last was said almost like a challenge and Tsunade's mouth twitched in either amusement or annoyance. Then the Hokage glanced over at Iruka as if sizing him up. Eventually she sighed. Fine, Tsunade said and waved her hand, I suppose it's only fair. But no one else, I can't send the entire damn village halfway across the continent. She flopped back into her chair, rubbing the bridge of her nose to fend off a headache. Iruka was stunned. He opened his mouth and closed it again, still looking between Tsunade and Kakashi. His gaze finally landed on the Hatake, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Just the night before the Jounin had managed to insult Iruka's occupation, intelligence, and rank in just one sentence, and today he was arguing to have the teacher on the team Kakashi would be leading. Iruka didn't have much time to dwell on it though, because in the next second Tsunade was sending them off to get packed and ready for the trip. Kakashi spared enough time to tell the newly assembled team to meet him at the gates in an hour. Iruka tried to catch Kakashi on their way out of the Hokage's office but the man disappeared into a swirl of leaves and wind the second he stepped outside. Sakura walked out next to him and mumbled, oh sure, disappear all mysterious without explaining anything. One day I'll be able to land a punch on that smug face of his, I swear it. Iruka gave her an amused glance, thought you'd be happy I'm trailing along. Sakura rolled her eyes at him, something Iruka thought she rather indulged in because he was no longer her teacher to punish her for sass. I am but it's the principle of the thing. Then her eyes fell on him as she said, and you don't just trail along, you know. Then she walked away in the direction of her house, the others dispersing as well to pack and eventually regroup by the gates. Iruka smiled bemusedly at her back as he wondered what she could mean by that. Deciding to decipher his ex-student later, Iruka shook his head and hurried in the direction of his own apartment. He packed quickly and threw on his green traveling cloak with the hood. It was old but one of the warmest things he'd ever owned and winter was settling into fire country. He'd never been as far as the land of waves and he wasn't sure what he was in for or how cold their winter was. He was making sure his apartment was in order and writing a note to Kotetsu and Izumo asking them to check on things now and then for him. When he passed through the kitchen and paused, on a whim he grabbed 2 instant ramen packets and threw them into his backpack. He looked at them sitting on top of his weaponry and extra clothes and laughed at himself quietly, just in case. He zipped his pack and stepped out his door. A thought struck Iruka as the gates came into view and he saw Kakashi standing with Sakura there glaring at her Jounin-sensei. The thought had something to do with Tsunade's sarcastic comment earlier. He realized that in all the time they'd been searching for Naruto, Kakashi had not been late to meet them. Not once. In fact, he was usually the first to make it to the gates, pack of Nikin ready and waiting. Iruka wasn't sure why that had occurred to him just then, but as he walked up to see Kakashi smiling at his pink-haired student to placate her, it was a temporary bomb he was glad for. When he got to the gates Kiba was grumbling, I don't see why we have to travel with a grumpy old goat like that Tazuna jerk. Tazuna didn't seem to hear this or decided to ignore it as he was going through Inari's pack as the boy complained he didn't need help remembering everything. Hinata just sighed as Shino said quietly, I'm just happy to be here, frankly. Kiba gave the Aburami a withering look, how are you still mad about that Sasuke thing? Shino only stayed silent, but there was a certain aura aimed at Shikamaru which the Nara wisely decided to shift slowly away from. Ino and Choji were there to see their teammate off, Ino also complaining, "I don't see why we couldn't go, too." "Tsunade has to keep some of us in the village," Shikamaru said reasonably, "and you have to keep an eye on Asuma-sensei and Kurenai. Just be safe, okay?" Choji said kindly, "We won't be there to watch your back." "We can watch his back just fine thanks," Kiba griped, and Ino stuck her tongue out at him. "Okay, that's enough." Captain Yamato walked up behind Irika, only just arriving himself. "Kakashi-senpai?" Kakashi raised his head from bluffing, checking his pack to avoid Sakura's glare, and ran his eye over the gathered people and nodded. Looking to Tazuna he said simply, "Lead the way." BREK. The trip to Wave Country was relatively uneventful, if one was able to ignore the almost constant bickering between Tazuna and Kiba and the death threats issuing from Sakura. Because of them, they arrived at the island by the Great Naruto Bridge, and that had been an interesting detour in the conversation that Tazuna had built. They had all oohed and awed sufficiently to make Tazuna's head swell 3 sizes. Irika recalled Naruto's narrative of the events, and several times was on the verge of asking Kakashi about it, figuring he'd be the most reliable of Team 7. But just like every other time Irika had tried to say something to the copynin on this trip, either to thank him or otherwise, the words just seemed to stick in his throat. Tazuna and Inari's village was small but prosperous. They went through a brief gate check where the keepers were terribly caught off guard to have so many ninjas show up without warning. Thanks to Tazuna's vote of confidence, they made their way through the gate easily enough and to the marketplace that was bursting with activity early in the day. Sakura kept staring around in disbelief. "It doesn't seem like the same village," she said at one point, watching in wonder as 2 children ran by laughing, skirting through vendor stalls full of food and other goods. Before it was so she trailed off with wide eyes. Tazuna turned to her, a soft, knowing smile on his face. Without Gato and the trade opened up by the bridge, the village flourished. He too watched the children race by. "It's not perfect, but we can feed everyone now. Even set up a decent orphanage. Ain't much really, but the kids got a roof, food, and some kindly ladies to take care of them. And you should see our house." Inari piped up, "I mean we had to fix it anyway, after those guys tried to kidnap my mom. But it's awesome." Inari went on about the changes to the house and village while Sakura listened patiently, smiling broadly the whole time. If Kakashi was affected by the change in the village it didn't show in his face. But it was hard for Irika to tell because of the mask. Kakashi was, however, leaning towards Yamato and Shikamaru mumbling an action plan. "We'll have to talk with Tsunami about her letter again. I want to make sure she didn't leave anything out. We should talk to the sailors and fishermen, too," Shikamaru said quietly, "see if they know any more about Whirlpool." Kakashi nodded in agreement. "It's still early. If we finish today, we can be on a boat by tomorrow." Yamato's mouth twitched most imperceptibly. "I thought Lady Hokage wanted us to be as thorough as possible before setting out for the other island. Not worried and in a rush are we, senpai?" "By the way," Kakashi said a little louder, so even Kiba could hear at the back of the group, "I was wondering if you would buy dinner for the group tonight, Yamato." It didn't sound like a request though. "I'd hate to put Tsunami-san to the task of feeding all these people, even if Tazuna-san has offered to put us up for the night." Kiba hooped as Yamato pouted at his superior. Kakashi just eye-smiled at him. Irika was a bit surprised himself. He had assumed they would be spending at least a few days investigating before heading to Whirlpool. Tsunami was a gracious host, greeting them almost urgently. She hugged Sakura and Kakashi, the latter of which looked like he might panic and stab the poor woman. Luckily, they got into the house without incident, and were sitting around the small kitchen table and on extra floor cushions respectively. Tsunami fussed over Inari and her father for a bit before setting out tea. "No offense to any of you, but I had honestly hoped we'd never have need of ninja in this village again." "None taken, ma'am," Sakura said politely. "We understand perfectly." "I suppose it is a little different now," Tsunami said, mostly to herself, "it being one of your own this time." She looked over at Kakashi. "You'll want to ask more about my letter, won't you?" Irika smiled to himself at her perceptiveness, as if she'd been listening in on their conversation on the way here. Such a mother. Kakashi blinked lazily at her. "Yes, but first I'd like to divide and conquer." Without preamble the copynin turned to Shikamaru. "I want you to take Team 10 and find out what you can from the boatmen and traders that have had anything to do with Whirlpool." Shikamaru nodded and stood, but Tazuna stopped them briefly to say, "Take Inari with you. He knows his way around." "Yes." Inari grinned and hopped up, leading the way out of the house again and back to the markets. "Maybe we'll ask around elsewhere, as well," Shikamaru said blandly as Hinata, Shino, Kiba, and Akamaru followed the excited boy outside, see if the other villagers saw him, or anything else unusual. "Good plan," Kakashi said, "way to be thorough." The Jounin-eyed Yamato, who looked on the verge of sticking his tongue out at his superior. Shikamaru rolled his eyes at the older men's antics, and slouched out behind Team 10. Irika felt the sudden urge to kick Kakashi under the table, so he did. Kakashi didn't jump or anything, but he did give Irika a glare worthy of Tsunade while Yamato sputtered and nearly choked on his tea. Maybe that was too far, Irika thought. Sakura cleared her throat, and the 3 men had the decency to look ever so slightly abashed. "So, Tsunami-san," Sakura said pointedly, "could you please tell us again what you saw?" Tsunami shrugged and sat down next to her father at the table. "Not much else to tell, really. Basically what was in that letter. She took a sip from her cup, taking a moment to think. Well, maybe not absolutely everything. Just what was important. Then tell us everything, Kakashi said, even if it seemed unimportant. Tsunami sighed, cradling her cup, and began quietly. Well, like I said in the letter, I spotted him in the marketplace while I was doing the shopping. I can show you where if you need. Anyway, I didn't recognize him immediately, I suppose because he is a bit older now, but then he turned and I saw those marks. She trailed 3 fingers across her face like 3 familiar whisker marks and smiled. And that blonde hair, just all over the place, such a boy. What was he doing when you saw him? Kakashi asked, and Iruka had to hold in questions of his own, remembering they were not here just for him to fret over Naruto's well-being. Nothing much, Tsunami shrugged, looking around, checking out the village. He had the same look you did, dear, she smiled at Sakura. The village has taken quite a turn since the last time you all were here. She paused and took another sip of her tea, contemplating. There was something odd about him though. Odd how? Iruka broke in without thinking. No one seemed to mind. It's probably just me, Tsunami said unsurely, flicking a hand in front of her. But I mentioned he ran away from me, right? They nodded and she continued, well, before he did that I noticed something. It was his eyes. She stopped again and looked at Kakashi, saying slowly, you remember how it was before? How the people in this village were, I mean. Kakashi nodded, raising an eyebrow as if trying to see where she was going with that. Tsunami just stood and went back to the stove to get the kettle. The villagers used to have this look about them. Hunted may be the word. Frightened, definitely. I didn't lie in my letter. Physically he seemed perfectly healthy, but his eyes, he had that look. The last part was whispered into the heavy silence. Yamato cleared his throat and Tsunami turned back to them as he said kindly, was there anything else, Tsunami-san? Yes, Tsunami seemed to come back to them and sat back down. Tazuna patted her shoulder, and she gathered herself a bit more. Yes. He was wearing all black, she finished bluntly. Black? Sakura blurted in surprise. Iruka blinked, and even Kakashi's head tilted in that Pakinesque fashion. Looked like he was going to a funeral. Tsunami nodded understandingly. I know young people like to experiment with clothing, but it was quite the change from that orange outfit he used to have. I'll say, Tazuna rumbled. It suited him better. Tsunami laughed. The orange, I mean, she sobered and continued. He was alone, I think. At least, no one followed him when he ran, that I noticed. Kakashi nodded and asked a few more questions, but Iruka's mind wandered. He had been reassuring himself with what Tsunami had written in her letter, that Naruto was fine and healthy. That seemed less true now, and Iruka suddenly understood Kakashi's haste. He glanced at the copynin and yet again felt the need to thank him, but didn't know how to say it. Nevertheless, the questions were finished and Tsunami had nothing else to report, except to reaffirm that she was sure Naruto was living on Whirlpool. Yamato stretched as Tsunami started cleaning up the tea things. If that's all, I guess it's time for me to go get dinner. The wood user threw a withering glance at Kakashi, who just smiled cheerfully. Oh, you don't have to, Tsunami started but was cut off by Kakashi. We insist, really. Even through the mask Iruka could see the smug grin as Yamato stood to go. I'll help you, Yamato-san, Iruka said and stood as well. I have a little extra saved up since I haven't had to buy as much ramen lately. Kakashi's eye narrowed at him as Iruka walked by and Iruka countered with a patented teacher glare. Iruka couldn't be certain, but he thought he heard Kakashi murmur something like, ruining my fun, as they left. The first place Shikamaru had them visit was the marketplace again, mainly asking where they could find out about trade on the island and to ask around like he told Kakashi they would. So far, Shikamaru had only found out that, yes, there were more strangers in town, but, no, it was a trade village and none of them stood out. Now he stood in an old, weather-beaten office in front of a well-used desk. Behind that sat white-haired man even older than Tazuna as his young assistant riffled through ordered documents trying to find the ones that pertained to Yuzushi Obikure. Can you tell us who first contacted you about trade with Whirlpool? Shikamaru asked the older man. Hinata was trying to help the assistant sift through papers. Shino and Kiba were still outside, talking with anyone they thought might know something about Whirlpool. So far all they'd gotten was rumor and superstition, but that had been mostly expected. You know, the man said after a moment's thought, scratching the side of his face, it's the strangest thing. I don't remember much about the initial contact, to be honest. He gave Shikamaru a rather baffled look and continued apologetically. Now, I'm getting on in years. I know. Had to pay the boy here to be my eyes for these damned old documents. But I still got all my wits about me. The papers for posterity's sake, really. I know just about every trade partner we have if you ask. The elder shook his head, but I can hardly remember how we started up with Whirlpool. Just that he trailed off and got a distant look in his eye and said, almost reverently, just that beautiful woman. Even the assistant stopped his shuffling with the papers and looked up. Oh yeah. I remember sort of. Hinata glanced at Shikamaru, the same question in her eyes. How do you remember someone, but not remember them? Why yes, the old man said, lovely lady. She came in and we must have talked a while because the next day I came in to all these orders that needed filling. She'd even paid half up front. Here. The assistant shouted suddenly, startling Hinata. The boy's face colored as his superior gave him a look. Sorry, but I found the files for Whirlpool. May I? Hinata asked kindly, holding out her hand for the files. The boy nodded and handed them over. Shikamaru watched her peruse them for a bit before he turned back to the elder. Is there anyone else we might be able to ask about Whirlpool? Someone who's maybe worked with them more directly. Actually been there? The white-haired man looked slightly pained. Oh, there ain't nobody that's actually stepped foot on that island around here. But there is someone you might be able to get something useful out of. Shikamaru said nothing, waiting. The old man sighed. Sanjiro is the only boat captain that'll go out there. The rest are too scared, but he was desperate enough to take a sketchy job. He's just as convinced as the rest of them that the place is haunted, but he hauls to and from there. I'd start with him. Shikamaru nodded as Hinata walked up beside him with the files, pointing at the list and murmuring, there's a lot here. Furniture, cloth, seeds, even animal food, homesteading-type stuff, the old man said assuredly. That's why everyone thinks it's just refugees. People that got displaced trying to make a new life in place they won't be bothered. If they're refugees, Shikamaru asked, how are they paying for all this? Different things, the tradesman said. At first it was regular gold currency, but I guess they ran out of that. They must be raising sheep cause they sent over some good quality wool a while back. Now it's things like medicine and herbs, things I hadn't heard of until Sanjiro came back with a boat full of it. I asked the local healer, and he nearly wet himself, I swear. Shikamaru made a mental note to relay that information to Sakura. Meanwhile, the old man nodded and explained, that's how it's worked since the beginning. Sanjiro makes a delivery, gets the next list, and brings it back to me. Those people like their privacy, I tell ya. The man's face scrunched in thought then, and he opened a drawer in his desk. That reminds me, I got their latest order right here. He pulled out a piece of parchment, and handed it to Shikamaru. Speaking of strange. Shikamaru glanced through the itemized list, and when he got to the bottom his eyes went wide, and he heard Hinata gasp over his shoulder. That's a lot of ramen, Shikamaru finally said hoarsely. I know, the old man laughed. I've been trying to figure out who to contact about that particular request. Shikamaru, Hinata tugged on his sleeve urgently. I'll get Kiba and Shino. He nodded at her and turned back to the man. Thank you for your help. Where can we find this Sanjiro? You didn't have to do that, Irika-sensei, Yamato was saying, shifting grocery bags around in his arms. It's really not a big deal. Irika figured even such a large meal probably wasn't a big deal on Jounin's budget, but he wasn't kidding when he said he had a little nest egg built up from 6 months of Naruto and his ramen eating habits. I figured I ought to make a hasty exit anyway, Irika said, dropping produce into a bag and paying the vendor, after kicking the famous copy ninja under the table. I mean, he explained to Yamato's confused face. Yamato laughed. I can't believe you did that. If I tried that, he shook his head. I guess that's why Kakashi-senpai likes you. I don't know about that, Irika said skeptically. At best he thought Kakashi just tolerated him because Irika was just as motivated as he was in finding their missing student. I heard about what he said to you in the bar, Yamato replied knowingly. At Irika's confused blink he explained with a shrug, Ninja Village. There are no secrets. If you heard about that then I don't know how you can think he likes me, Irika said distractedly, leading the way to another stall. Yamato sighed. Senpai doesn't usually care what other people think of him or what he says, so his mouth tends to get him in trouble when he does care. Yamato paused at a vendor selling little knickknacks while he spoke. Trust me. I and the rest of Team 7 can attest. Besides, he always finds a way to apologize. Irika huffed in disbelief. I have yet to hear an apology, I'm afraid. Oh, I didn't say you would hear an apology, Sensei, Yamato said, a wry smile on his face. I said he'd find some way to let you know he's sorry. This mission, for instance. Irika just looked at his companion curiously, so Yamato continued. He knew Tsunade wanted you in the village for the opening of the academy, but he also knew that you would prefer to be here. He made sure you were here. Yamato's head tilted in a way that asked, get it? This mission is his apology? Irika clarified unnecessarily, but Yamato nodded confirmation anyway. And I kicked him? Yamato laughed at Irika's stricken expression, and the teacher tried to hide his red face behind the bulky grocery bags in his arms. That's why he likes you, the wood user snickered. You're not scared of him. Famous copy ninja or not. He gets tired of people treating him like he's fragile. If you say so, Irika murmured, dropping the subject as Yamato asked directions to the fish market. He didn't see how anyone could consider Kakashi fragile. But if Yamato thought the copy nin was actually trying to be friendly, Irika was willing to go along with it. Better than the crippling awkwardness that seemed to follow them since Naruto's Chunin exams. The boat was not much in comparison to many of the other fishing and trading vessels lining the docks, but it was obviously well cared for by competent hands. And it flew orange flags. If Shikamaru needed any more proof that Naruto was at the center of whatever was happening on Whirlpool, that was it. Did he make the flags out of an old jumpsuit or? His thoughts were rudely interrupted by Kiba banging loudly on the door to the bridge shouting, anybody home? We need a ride to a haunted island. Akamaru banged the whole time. How do you deal with him all the time? Shikamaru asked, looking at Shino and Hinata, the latter of which had her face in her hands. Shino glanced at Shikamaru and reached up under his hood, pulling an earplug out of his ear. My apologies. Did you say something? Shikamaru sighed and spoke so Kiba could hear over the bang. Will you cut that out? We need this guy's help, you know? Kiba turned and was about to yell something back when there was a loud, dull thud and they all ducked down while watching the harpoon that still twanged where it had lodged into the wood of the door. Instantly, Shikamaru pulled the kunai and turned to where the projectile had come from, Shino and Hinata doing the same. Akamaru put himself between his master and the threat, growling as Kiba pulled his own weapons. Well, ain't that just fine, a man with gray-streaked hair and a harpoon gun said from the stern of the ship. I try to defend my poor boat from getting demolished by some scrawny brat, and I get knives pulled on me. Just fine indeed. Shikamaru lowered his weapon slightly, seeing that the man had no more harpoons to shoot. Are you Sanjiro? Who the hell else would be on my boat? Sanjiro asked and hopped down to the deck, except in a few noisy brats trying to break down the door. Aside from the gray streaks in his hair, the man's skin was so brown it looked like leather, and his face was scarred, slate-gray eyes staring out of it. He stood about a head taller than Shikamaru and stringy muscles stood out from years of boating and fishing. He glared over at Kiba, seemingly unaffected by the kunai. Shino and Hinata still aimed at him. Now boy, either get the hell off my boat or explain what you mean by haunted island. Akamaru growled a little and Kiba looked like he was about to start throwing insults, so Shikamaru stepped into Sanjiro's immediate line of vision. Sanjiro-san, please ignore my teammate. The Nara gave a respectful bow and simultaneously signaled the others to put away the weapons and do the same. Kiba grumbled but gave a twitchy little bow. When they all straightened, Shikamaru continued, I hope you can forgive us, sir. Yes, we did not mean to be rude, Hinata said politely, clasping her hands in front of her. We really need your help. Sanjiro didn't show any outward sign of appeasement at the apology, but he locked eyes with Shikamaru and said, Interesting way you got of a skin for help. But never mind, ain't the worst that's happened to the old girl. Sanjiro tapped the harpoon gun on the deck with a small, proud smile. Now, back to my question. What do you brats want to know about haunted islands? Quickly, before the man could find another reason to harpoon them, Shikamaru explained, we need to know about the land of whirlpools. The tradesman said you're the only one to ever go to the island, we were hoping. He was cut short by Sanjiro's hand waving through the air, saying, I ain't never set foot on that island. Never seen what's livin' on it either. If that's all you wanted to know, I'll be on my way. Wait, sir, please. Hinata jumped in front of him as Sanjiro made a move toward the bridge door. The old fisherman huffed and glared at the girl in front of him. Now listen, missy, I don't. How can you deliver goods to and from a place? Shikamaru cut the man off this time. If you've never seen who you're trading with. Because, brat, I don't meddle in private affairs, Sanjiro snapped, raising his harpoon gun and poking the Nara in the chest with the end. Shikamaru heard Akamaru growl as the man continued, may not even be regular people living on that island, I tell you. I dunno if it's ghosts or demons or just some poor saps that got exiled. But I ain't gonna meddle. He set the gun back down and leaned on it, explaining, they pay me to drop the goods in the bay on a dock they anchored offshore. They leave their payment in a new list or instructions for me to follow, and that's it. I don't have to see them and they don't have to see me. End of story. He pushed himself upright and walked to the bridge door again, waving Kiba out of the way and yanking the harpoon out of the wood. Shikamaru thought for a moment, then said suddenly, would you be willing to take us there? What? Sanjiro turned abruptly, startled by the request. Why in hell would you want to go there? We have our reasons, Shino broke in, but we could pay you to take us. We have 7 people with us in all. 8, Kiba grumbled, pointing to Akamaru, we have 8. Will you take us? Shikamaru asked again, looking the man in the eye. Sanjiro sighed and rubbed the back of his head as he looked up at the orange flags flapping in the sea breeze. Listen, kid, y'all just don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. That place, he shook his head, his wrinkled and scarred face looking that much older all of a sudden. Back during those wars, you see. We know about the village that used to be there, Hinata said gently. No, you don't. Sanjiro gave them all a hard look. It was a massacre that day. I remember it, just like every other fisherman that's old enough to tell stories about the wars. I helped fish the bodies out of the water that washed up to our shores. And I know, not just the ninja were killed. Women, children, I know there were survivors, but there's a reason they never went back. When people die like that, he paused again and tapped his harpoon gun a little too hard. That much blood spilt like it was, that leaves a mark. I got no interest talking anybody to that island. Even Kiba went quiet after Sanjiro's outburst. Hinata took a slow step back from the man and looked at Shikamaru questioningly. The Nara nodded and asked the fisherman, then would you consider taking us to the dock you dropped the goods at? The boat captain's eyes narrowed at him, but Shikamaru held them. Finally, Sanjiro sighed again and asked, you're bound and determined to get over there, ain't ya? Shikamaru nodded once and held the man's gaze still. Fine. I'll take your party to the dock but no farther. Y'all are on your own after that. You know, a familiar but unexpected voice came from the door, nearly making Naruto startle. I think I preferred the orange. Naruto turned calm now, to see Mei leaning casually in the doorframe. I thought you hated the orange? He asked in confusion, hoping she was here for something more important than his wardrobe. You said it made you want to rip out your own eyes and burn them. I didn't say it wasn't tacky as all hell, Mei smiled, her perfect red lips pulling back to show off perfect white teeth. I said I preferred it on you. She flicked a lock of her long dark hair over her shoulder in distaste. Now you just look like you're in mourning. Maybe we are, HM? Naruto cleared his throat and tried to clear his head at the same time. My old clothes were ripped. I can't go around with ripped clothes. And this was all Ohara-san had at the time. There was no reason to trouble her again when a new shipment came in. Mei was still smirking knowingly at him and Naruto worked very hard not to stick his tongue out at her. He protests too much, she murmured, laughter in her green eyes. And Oharu can repair rips, you know? Did you only come here to harass me about my clothes? Naruto finally snipped. Or is something important happening? He crossed his arms over his chest. As beautiful and intimidating as she was, sometimes Mei could be too motherly for her own good. She wasn't that much older than him. Mei held her hands up in surrender but the laughter didn't leave her pretty face. Alright, love, alright. She pulled the lock of hair back over her shoulder just to have something to fiddle with. Firstly, Tosan and Matsuko are fighting about the bridge again, she explained apologetically. Again? Naruto groaned and flopped back into a chair. What is it now? The usual, Mei shrugged. One just wants to get it done and the other thinks he just has no artistic vision. She gave an elegant flourish with her hand at the last bit. I'm personally on the side of getting it done, Naruto grumbled. Well, be sure to put it a little more diplomatically when you go over there to work it out, Mei replied. And one other thing. Sanjiro's boat is dropping something off at the dock. A scout spotted the flags from the top of the hill. Naruto looked up in confusion. He's not due back yet, is he? Mei shook her head. Not for another 2 days, I thought. The blonde nodded and stood back up. Would you mind? I'll take Scout and Izo. Mei nodded, understanding his meaning. Maybe he just got his shipment in early and was keen to have more time between deliveries. Probably, Naruto agreed. Sanjiro was too superstitious of the island to come back without need. Just be careful. Always, darling, Mei chirped and glided off in search of the others. Naruto headed in the direction of the bridge to take care of things, hoping whatever was going on with Sanjiro was harmless. It's never harmless, brat. You ought to know that by now. Kakashi was feeling more than a little smug that they managed to be on the boat the next day and heading for Whirlpool, just like he planned. Sanjiro, the captain, had agreed to take them, thanks to Shikamaru, but had needed even more convincing to take them before his next shipment was due. I ain't supposed to arrive there again for another 2 days, Sanjiro had said. I'm not keen on showing up when I ain't expected. Who knows what they'll do? Kakashi had gotten around this without much difficulty due to his expert negotiating skills, or by subtly implying that the dangers on Whirlpool would be the least of the boat captain's worries if the man didn't comply with their request. Either way, they were on the boat in the wee hours of the morning the next day and Kakashi was feeling a bit smug about it. They were all currently below deck in a very moldy-smelling storage compartment where the captain had so kindly told them to stay because he didn't need a bunch of idiot armed ninja running around his boat while pulling up to a demon-infested island. It was crowded, but Kiba was doing a pretty decent job of keeping them all entertained as he talked animatedly with Yamato. I'm just saying, what if the daimyo have a secret laboratory on the island, like Orochimaru? And they're, like, experimenting on people, like he did with you. And then Naruto comes out and he's got some crazy new jutsu or he can, I dunno, spew acid or fly or something. Kiba said this all in one breath, leaning eagerly over the long table where he sat across from Yamato. The NBU just stared back at the boy in silence for a minute as if trying to decide whether to answer or throw him overboard. Kiba, could you do me a favor? Yamato asked slowly after that minute. Kiba sat back a bit, looking confused. Yeah, sure. From now on, could you wait until I've had at least 2 cups of coffee before you talk? Yamato asked wearily, indicating the single mug in front of him. Sakura and Hinata giggled as Kiba's face fell into a pout, and he crossed his arms over his chest. Akamaru put his head on his master's knee as if to comfort. That's an improvement, Iruka said from Yamato's side. When he was in the academy I needed 3. Even Shino and Shikamaru smiled at that one as the girls continued to snicker at Kiba's expense. Another side effect of this mission was that Yamato and Iruka-sensei had gotten rather chummy over the course of it. It wouldn't bother Kakashi if they didn't gang up on him and accuse him of worrying when he intimidated, or convinced, the boat captain to set sail early. How long till we get there? Kiba grumbled in Kakashi's direction. Round this time tomorrow, Kakashi replied monotonously over his Aika. Kiba groaned dramatically and his forehead slammed into the tabletop. Sanjiro-san doesn't expect us to stay down here the whole time, does he? Sakura asked skeptically. He said we could stretch our legs, Shikamaru said from where his chair was leaned back on 2 legs against the wall. But be careful if you do. Sakura looked up at him. What for? He's got a twitchy trigger finger, Shino replied much to Kiba's amusement. Sakura raised an eyebrow and looked to Hinata for an explanation but only received a shrug. Anyway, Sakura said slowly, looking back over at Shikamaru, you said you had something for me? Oh yeah, Shikamaru reached into his vest pocket and retrieved a small cloth bag. Got this from the local healer on Wave. It's an herb the settlers on Whirlpool have been trading with them. Sakura took the bag and reached inside, pulling out a small stem of green leaves that came to a purple tip. She thought for a second, then her eyes lit with recognition. Oh, I know this one. Agilis, known for its versatility. She twirled the stem in her fingers, admiring the little plant. It's kind of pretty, Hinata said, picking up one of the stray leaves that fell from the bag, Kiba following suit out of boredom. Sakura continued, it's a disinfectant and a numbing agent, nice when you have to stitch something up outside of a hospital. You can make balm from it to help with cuts and burns. Really useful when you're in the field. No wonder they were excited about it. It's hard to get something like this way out here. Agilis is really tricky to grow and only a few farmers have the patience and skill for it, so normally only big villages like Konoha can afford it or grow it on their own. Kakashi glanced over his book again and gave the little plant another look after Sakura's mini-lecture. I think I recognize it, too. Sakura smirked at him. You would, wouldn't you? That's probably because in its basic, concentrated form it's actually a poison. Ninja can dip their weapons in its oil to paralyze enemies. Kiba! Get that out of your mouth! Iruka suddenly roared, surprising all of them by diving across the table to whack Kiba on the back of the head. Kiba sputtered and spit out the little leaf he'd apparently decided was a good idea to taste. Am I gonna die? He asked, hacking and rubbing his tongue with his sleeve. Kiba? Hinata's hands went to his shoulders while Shino and Yamato stood. My mouth feels fuddy. Kiba wailed, Shikawa, do something. Sakura sighed and rolled her eyes. Calm down, you guys. That quantity and concentration isn't enough to kill anyone. A sigh of relief escaped everyone but Kiba. But your tongue and the rest of your mouth is going to be numb for a while, so your speech will be impaired. You'll be fine after that. Kiba let out a relieved sigh and collapsed back in his chair with the rest of the team. Sakura glanced back down at the purple-tinged leaves, then back at Kiba, and her lips pursed unsurely. But you know, just in case. She reached under the table for her pack and started searching through it. Let me give you something that will neutralize the worst if it, she chuckled awkwardly. Lady Tsunade wouldn't be too happy if I let your heart stop because I was careless. Kiba made few inarticulate whimpers and started poking at his tongue while Shino grumbled. Why would you stick it in your mouth? It's like working with a toddler. Kiba just whimpered again, and Akamaru gave him a lick to the face. Yamato gave Iruka a questioning look, to which the teacher just shrugged helplessly. It's always been like this. Naruto was about the same, if not worse. Kakashi thought he had managed to hide his impending laughing fit during all this, but he thought he saw Iruka cast him a slight glare of disapproval over his book. Sakura started berating Kiba about proper handling of medicinal substances after that, but really the rest of the ride went by without incident. The next morning Kakashi woke up before everyone else to do a head count. Well, he assumed it was morning. There was no easy way to tell when below deck of a boat, but his internal clock said it was, and it was as reliable as the sun most of the time. Kakashi briefly wondered at his reasoning behind a head count, because there wasn't much place to go on a small fishing vessel, but he supposed it was a leftover habit from having a genin team. Those little buggers had a tendency to get some wild hair in the middle of the night, and ended up not where you left them in the AM. Nevertheless, he counted the sleeping forms of the boys first, wondering briefly if he should wake Kiba before the boy drowned in the impressive puddle of drool he produced from his still numb mouth, and peeked behind the barrels the girls had opted to sleep behind for some semblance of privacy. Apparently he was not, in fact, the first one awake, because Kakashi came up one short. Again, there weren't many places for a person to disappear to on a boat, so Kakashi headed up the ladder leading to the deck. The sky was overcast, so he still couldn't be completely certain what time it was yet. The salt air surrounded him in earnest when he stepped out onto the deck and located his missing ninja. Iruka-sensei stood looking out at the blue-black water, gripping the railing of the boat. Kakashi laughed to himself. Iruka-sensei, a missing nin. Could just imagine. You're up early, Kakashi said aloud as Iruka turned at his approach. The sensei smiled softly. Oh, please, I'm a teacher. The day is half gone already. Kakashi cocked his eyebrow at that but said nothing. Iruka accepted his silence with his own and turned back to look at the horizon. Kakashi was taking his time going back down below deck, stretching his legs and just moving around to get the kinks out after sitting in the cramped room for so long. I've never been on a boat like this before, Iruka murmured suddenly. Kakashi turned and Iruka seemed to realize he'd spoken to an audience. I've been on a boat before, of course, never on the ocean. It's different from the lakes and rivers back home. Kakashi blinked at the realization that Iruka was actually trying to make conversation with him. The teacher had barely said 3 words to him the whole trip, unless kicking him under a table counted as conversation. Weird, Kakashi replied finally. I would have thought with your name and all. He finished vaguely, but Iruka seemed to catch his meaning. The Chunin smirked at him and asked, Do you ever get the sudden urge to stand in the middle of a field and scare birds away from crops? Kakashi felt a smile tug at his mouth and wondered if Iruka could tell through his mask, once, but not for quite the same reason you're thinking. Kakashi almost startled when Iruka barked a laugh and said, I guess I am weird then. For a second, Iruka looked like he wanted to say something else but stayed quiet. Kakashi shrugged to himself, feeling an odd sense of victory in his chest that he simply would not admit had anything to do with making Iruka laugh. Suddenly, Iruka lurched and leaned forward on the railing, his entire upper body hanging dangerously over the dark water below. Kakashi's arm reacted without his permission, reaching out and was a centimeter away from grabbing the back of Iruka's cloak when the teacher pulled back and pointed excitedly to the horizon. Look! Iruka said excitedly, heedless of Kakashi's slip. Can you see it? Kakashi blinked again and turned his head to follow the teacher's finger, squinting at the distance. I don't, Kakashi started, but stopped when a speck on the horizon became apparent. Oh yeah, whirlpool, Iruka said quietly. I thought there would be more, whirlpools? Yamato said to Sanjiro as they neared the dock on the middle of a wide bay, where the water was almost completely still and calm. And there would be, Sanjiro said gruffly as he gathered the rope he would use to latch onto the dock, if we'd taken any other route. Made that mistake myself the first time I made a delivery. Nearly tore the old girl apart, he patted the railing apologetically. This here's the old trade route the village used before the wars. Only safe way in or out. Well, only way I know of. The rest of the team had emerged when Kakashi had judged they were close enough to the island, which was no longer a speck but a lush, overgrown forest surrounding the bay, a line of large, gray rocks bordering the water. Broken and rotting wooden piers stuck out at intervals from these rocks, a tribute to the trade that used to happen in this part of the island. The only thing that looked new was the dock floating in the center of the bay, an unseen anchor keeping it in place. The younger shinobi were staring around in fascination, Hinata even activating her Byakugan, either to see the island better or search for signs of life. Kakashi didn't know. Shino and Shikamaru were conversing next to her, and Kiba was still harassing Sakura with a worried Akamaru by his side. Still Sietao, Kiba was wailing and pointing at his numb mouth, which was still producing copious amounts of drool. Sakura must have understood the gist of it, because she snapped back, I told you already, there's nothing more I can do. Just drink lots of water and wait till it wears off. Kakashi tuned them out in favor of watching the dock approach. The dock was where Sanjiro climbed over the side of the boat and nimbly hopped down and tied the boat, never once touching the water. He climbed back up and looked at them sternly. This is where I leave you. I won't go any farther. He rubbed his scruffy cheek thoughtfully. I'll be back with the next shipment in 2 days. If you're ready to leave by then just meet me back here and I'll haul you back to Wave. It sounded like he meant to say if you're still alive. Thank you, Sanjiro-san. Irika spoke up from Kakashi's side, smiling kindly. We'll keep that in mind. With that the teacher hopped the side of the boat much like the captain just had and leapt silently down to the dock below, pack strapped to his back and waiting for the rest of them readily. Kakashi felt that smile threaten again. As leader of the mission, Kakashi waited until the others were off the boat before following them down. When they were all standing on the dock and looking up at the boat, Sanjiro seemed suddenly reluctant to just leave them there. Last chance to turn back, he called down. We'll be fine, Yamato placated, and just then a wind kicked up that seemed to come from the direction of the island, blowing Sanjiro's gray-streaked hair and making the old man's eyes go wide. The boat captain grumbled something about crazed shinobi and their idiot ideas but said so they could hear, right? I'll be off and back in 2 days. Remember. He disappeared into the bridge, and soon the boat was sailing back the way it had come. Yamato turned to Kakashi then and asked, that was you, wasn't it? That conveniently placed breeze? Kakashi's eye widened innocently. I don't know what you could be implying. There was a small splash to his right then, and Kakashi looked to see Irika standing on top of the water staring at him. If you're done messing with elderly fishermen, he tapped his foot in the water impatiently, making a little splash noise. Always ruining my fun, Kakashi grumbled and herded the rest onto the bay water to join the teacher, setting a brusque pace for the shore. As they ran over the water, Kakashi saw Hinata look down in surprise and activate her widening eyes again. The Kopinin followed suit out of curiosity, and saw the eerie sight that had caught her attention. The water was clearer the closer they got to shore and the shallower it got. Under the surface was a jungle of sunken wood and metal skeletons of ships that used to inhabit the bay. They rested at the bottom, only the pieces closest to the surface showing clearly, reaching up as if to pull them down to their level, the rest of their bodies disappearing into the depths. Kakashi wondered unwillingly if the ships had been sunk after the island was vacated due to disuse, or before to prevent escape. Kakashi was somewhat relieved to reach the rocky shore. He summoned Pakin as soon as they reached the shore and climbed over the rocks onto more level ground. Hey boss, the little pug greeted him, sniffing the air subtly and taking in the gathered team. What's up? The others were spread out searching the tree line and getting the lay of the area while Kakashi explained briefly, Whirlpool Island. This is where we think Naruto is, with others probably. He would have said more but Irika saw the little pug and greeted him warmly. Oh, hello Pakin. How are you? Kakashi blinked as Pakin's normally saggy eyes lit up at the sight of the Chunin. Doing well Irika-sensei. Glad to see you're here. The dog's eyes widened to puppy-like proportions then and Irika laughed, digging in his bag. Irika pulled out a smaller bag and produced a meatball from it. Don't worry, I didn't forget, and tossed it to Pakin who caught it in his mouth, chewing happily. Kakashi said eloquently after this exchange and looked at Irika in disbelief. How long have you been spoiling my dog? Irika shrugged as Akamaru walked up and pawed at the teacher's pant leg, tongue hanging out. Irika smiled and held a meatball out for the larger Nikin as well, saying, the whole time, I guess. Akamaru gave the sensei a grateful lick and Pakin chuckled deviously. Kakashi heard a snort behind him and turned toward Yamato in betrayal. You knew about this? Yamato just shrugged guiltily as Shikamaru called from the tree line. Everyone knew about it, Kakashi-sensei. Rolling his eyes he added. Hinata found a path hidden by some brush. It's old but recently used. Deciding to put the ruining of his prized Nikin on hold for now, Kakashi sighed and walked over to the Nara, Pakin leading the way. Kiba gave Akamaru a signal and he and Pakin began sniffing the entrance of the path where Hinata stood. If they're smart it's trapped, Sakura murmured needlessly. Here, Shino answered her anyway, reached into the brush that hid the path and ordered back up. The group did and Shino pulled out a piece of nearly invisible wire his bugs had swarmed. They watched as that simple pressure unleashed a barrage of kunai from the trees on either side of the path, wooden posts carved to spikes shooting out of the ground at intervals farther and farther down, stopping only when the last kunai flew. So we should be careful, Pakin, the little smartass said, staring at the wooden spike closest to him, probably with visions of pub kebabs swimming in his head. But people have definitely been coming through here recently. Not picking up Naruto's scent in particular, but it may be covered by the others. Kakashi hummed, and instructed shortly, we'll stick to the trees. With that the group followed him into the ancient forest, following the little path through the trees instead. Pakin and Akamaru led the way, pausing and sniffing now and then. The forest got thicker the farther inland they went, the path becoming harder to discern through the overgrowth. It completely disappeared as the forest gave way to swampland. It was here that both dogs stopped suddenly and began sniffing frantically. Kakashi and Kiba both dropped to the ground when their Nikan leapt from the trees, the dogs putting their noses to the soggy ground. Kiba sniffed the air a bit as well, but didn't say anything, probably because he still couldn't. Pakin looked over at Akamaru as if to confirm something, and the larger dog gave a little nod. The kid's scent is definitely here, boss, Pakin said finally, as the rest of the leaf ninja joined them on the ground, careful of more traps. Kakashi heard Irika shift behind him. Here? Yamato questioned, looking around at the rather inhospitable marsh. Sakura also wrinkled her nose at the smell of stagnant mud and general rot that came with swampy ground. Hinata's eyes were activated and searching, as were Shino's insects, the latter seeming almost cheerful at the surroundings. There were a few extra buzzing things in the air here if Shikamaru's waving hand was any indication. Pakin nodded, just to pass through. The trail doesn't end here. This way. And they were off again, this time choosing to stay grounded for the sake of the dogs. The search slowed as the spongy earth of the swamp converted completely to muddy water. The only solid ground to be found was tufts of scraggly grass and the roots of old, smooth trees. They had no problem walking through it, but the dogs had a harder time picking up scents in the water, having to stop several times and see which root or mound of mud held the next clue. The sky was still overcast, perpetually looking on the edge of a storm, but Kakashi judged they'd been at it maybe an hour before something changed. It was nothing tangible, but it made the hair on the back of his neck raise, and he'd learned from years of experience to trust that little feeling of unease. When Pakin and Akamaru both stopped and looked up in slight alarm, Kakashi threw his arm out to signal the others stop as well. Kiba was by his ninkin's side in a second, and every other ninja went on high alert. But the swamp was silent. Then Hinata whispered, "Does anyone else feel that?" Kakashi turned to look at the Hyuga and saw her looking at the water. Then he felt it. The water was moving, vibrating like it was about to boil. Before Kakashi could give the order to move, the water beneath them exploded. Kakashi landed in water that was deeper than he thought it would be, managing to gather his chakra and get himself standing on top of it in a matter of seconds. He heard sputtering beside him and spared a glance at Yamato, also getting to his feet in the water to his left before looking up at the thing staring back at him. It was a crocodile. A really big, really pissed off crocodile. The armored body reached almost to the treetops where its upper half had reared out of the swamp. Water cascaded off its green-brown skin and rained down on them. Its massive head was turned toward Kakashi and Yamato, yellow eyes locking onto them as its body fell forward into the murky water. Kakashi and Yamato dodged and ran together as the croc lunged their way, long maw open to reveal rows of giant teeth as it released a primordial sound. The beast was fast for being so large. When it turned to follow them, it took no heed of the trees blocking its path, just went through them. "Where are the others?" Kakashi yelled over the noise of the crocodile battering its way through the marsh. The crocodile lunged again and the two jounin took to the trees, not that it helped when the monster could knock them down like toothpicks. "I see the kids behind it," Yamato shouted back. "I don't think it's seen them." The croc's long tail lashed out then, and Kakashi caught sight of all too familiar pink, as Sakura barely dodged. There was another swirl of air as Kiba and Akamaru attempted a synchronized attack, but apparently didn't account for the creature's thick skin. The two just bounced off its flank and landed practically up under it. They were, however, successful in getting the croc to notice them. Kakashi pushed his Hitaite up to reveal the Sharingan, and leapt just as the reptile lunged for the younger shinobi again. Lightning surrounded his hand as he aimed for what he hoped would be a weaker point in the animal's armor, the fleshy joint where its front leg joined with its body. Kakashi landed on the thing's back as his lightning cutter connected and cut into the crocodile's skin as it screeched. The cut was as long as Kakashi was tall, but couldn't be more than a flesh wound for the beast. Nevertheless, it was enough to piss it off more and take its attention away from the younger shinobi, so the Kopinin considered it a small victory. At least until the croc bucked, throwing him into the air, and twisted, opening its mouth to make sure Kakashi had a clear, unhindered path into its waiting stomach. The Kopinin saw monstrous teeth flash in front of him, and felt the humid heat of the croc's cavernous mouth before there was a puff of smoke and leaves and the croc snapped down on nothing but air. Kakashi transported himself back into the tree with Yamato in seconds. From a distance he thought he heard someone angrily shouting at him, but didn't have time to pick out who. Shikamaru joined in then and attempted to pin the crocodile down using his shadow technique, but the overcast and general gloom of the swamp hindered him. He managed to slow it down though and signaled for his age mates to run. They did so reluctantly but did not retreat far. Yamato made a few hand seals and planks of wood shot out of the mud and wrapped around the croc. Kakashi followed up with a water dragon jutsu. Much like the trees though, it broke through these easily and began thrashing wildly to the point Shikamaru had to back off and make a run for it as well. That accounted for the younger shinobi, but where was there? Kakashi spotted a now filthy green cloak in the water, Irika. The teacher was backing away slowly, but from his position in the tree Kakashi couldn't see what else he was doing, or if he was injured. He didn't have time to worry about Irika though, when he saw the croc take a little too much interest in where Shikamaru and the others had run. The water rumbled again, and for a second Kakashi thought another one was about to pop up. A second later he readied the hand seals for another water jutsu, but realized someone had beat him to it. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Irika slap the top of the water with the palm of his hand. The swamp exploded again. Mud and water shot up together underneath the crocodile, carrying it up into the air, above the tree line and farther. It let out another inhuman roar as it became airborne, jaws snapping at the water propelling it upward. The spray shut off even more quickly than it started, like a tap being turned off. "We should move," Kakashi said matter-of-factly and grabbed Yamato just as the beast came crashing back down into the trees. The tree they had just been in went down as well, but the croc had landed on its back, disappearing under the water and the massive wave that resulted from the landing. "Faster," Yamato called from behind him, but then the world was mud, water, mad tumbling, and trying to find the surface when everything was the same shade of brown. Kakashi broke the surface of the water just in time to be washed unceremoniously onto a rare tuft of reeds and trees as the wave receded. He could hear the beast still throwing a fit somewhere in the distance, but could no longer see it. He hoped to keep it that way. Well, Yamato sat up on the semi-solid ground beside Kakashi. That was fun. Kakashi just shook his head like a dog to get the majority of the water and muck out of his hair and eyes, suddenly realizing that he had not only lost track of the kids and Irika but Pakken as well. "Kakashi-san," the copy-nin almost jumped when the unexpected, although very welcome voice came from the trees in front of them. Kakashi looked up to see Irika trudging over to them, covered head to toe in muck, hair undone and dripping in his face. "And Captain Yamato, are you all right?" "As well as can be expected, sensei," Yamato replied for them both. "You?" Irika just nodded tiredly and plopped down gracelessly next to them on their little patch of grass. "I can only do that once. It takes more chakra than I should really use." "That was you?" Yamato asked, pointing in the direction they just splashed from. Irika shrugged and then turned an unprovoked glare at Kakashi. "In case we don't get out of this alive, there's something I need you to know." "Okay," Kakashi said, wringing out his headband out and weighing the necessity of putting it back on his face. "I hate you," Irika said without preamble. Kakashi blinked. "Oh, and I consider you a friend," Irika continued, scowling harshly. "So don't pull any more dumb shit like almost getting eaten again, okay?" Now, did anyone see where everyone else went? Kakashi was really beginning to debate who was crazier: elite, highly skilled and rigorously trained jounin or academy school teachers. "They were running in the other direction," Yamato said, breaking into Kakashi's thoughts. "They were together, so they should be fine. And they have Kiba and Akamaru with them." Kakashi stood then, put a hand to his mouth and let loose a shrill whistle. Irika held his hands to his ears as he asked, "The heck was that for?" "Pakken," Kakashi said simply. "He got separated from us too." "Oh," Irika said, suddenly looking concerned. "Well, can't you just summon him again?" "Doesn't work like that," Kakashi said simply. "Maybe he..." Irika started again, but Yamato's kunai shot over his shoulder, startling him into silence. Kakashi spun to where Yamato was aiming, his own kunai in hand. Irika did the same but a little slower, making the copy-nin wonder just how much chakra he used up with that last jutsu. Nothing moved in the trees and brush where Yamato's weapon had disappeared, but Kakashi felt a significant chakra signature within. In fact, it almost felt like the other chakra signature was reaching back, feeling for them, almost surrounding them. Finally, there was a rustle and a shadow moved. Slowly, carefully the shadow picked its way out of the brush, taking shape with each step. It was a girl that stepped out, fingering the sheared white hair above her left ear that Yamato's blade had sliced through. "Hello, what if Naruto Kage of another village Kage Summit, and thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoyed this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel, and leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down, and thanks for watching the video, and see you guys in the next video."